Hello and welcome for today's cryptid horror stories. In the comments, where are you from and what kind of cryptids do you like? Now for the stories. The Sky Will Scream. The morning air in the Wyoming clearing carried the copper scent of blood mixed with the sharp fragrance of crushed pine needles. Forensic photographer Sarah Chen crouched beside the mangled remains, her hands trembling so violently that she could barely maintain her grip on the camera. She had documented nearly 200 crime scenes in her 8 years with the county sheriff's department, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for the horror splayed before her like some obscene biological experiment gone wrong. The victim had been a 34-year-old environmental surveyor named Marcus Webb, and what remained of him defied every natural law Sarah understood. His ribcage had been splayed outward, the bones snapped and splintered so that they jutted from his torso like the broken wings of some flightless bird. His spine curved at an impossible angle, twisted until the vertebrae had separated, and his head lolled back to touch his own heels. But worst of all, far worse than the evisceration or the way his internal organs seemed to have been systematically arranged in a circle around the body, was the fusion. Sarah's camera flash illuminated the nightmare in staccato bursts of harsh white light. The victim's flesh had somehow merged with the pine needles carpeting the clearing. Individual needles had pierced through skin and emerged on the other side, as if the forest floor itself had reached up to claim him. Bark had begun to sprout from his exposed bone marrow. His fingernails had elongated into wooden splinters, dark and resinous, and where his eyes should have been, there were only hollow sockets filled with packed soil and spruce cones. "Jesus Christ," whispered Deputy Haverson from the tree line, his voice cracking. He had already vomited twice, and Sarah could see the bile stains on his uniform shirt. "Sarah, you getting all this? The sheriff wants everything documented before the FBI arrives." Sarah didn't answer. She was staring at the victim's phone, which had been found clutched in his wooden fused hand. The screen was cracked but still functional, and she had already scrolled to the last photo taken. The timestamp read 6:42 p.m., 3 minutes before Marcus's Apple Watch recorded his heart stopping. The image showed the clearing from his perspective, late afternoon light filtering through the canopy, the peaceful green world of the Bighorn Mountains. And above it all, blotting out the sun, was a shadow. Not a cloud, not a storm front, something else entirely. The shadow had shape, vast, angular, wrong. 2 protrusions extended from its silhouette like arms or wings, and at its center, Sarah could almost make out the suggestion of eyes, 2 pinpricks of absolute darkness against the already black mass. The shadow was larger than a barn, larger than a house, larger than anything that had any right to exist in the sky. Sarah photographed the phone screen, her mind racing with impossible explanations. She didn't believe in monsters. She believed in evidence, in documentation, in the cold rationality of forensic science. But as she stared at the fused corpse, at the bark growing from bone and the way the pine needles seemed to pulse with faint, rhythmic warmth, she felt the foundations of her rationality beginning to crack. 3 weeks later, at a remote research station 2,000 miles north in the Alaskan wilderness, Dr. Elias Veyer was having similar thoughts about the nature of reality. The station was a prefabricated structure of corrugated metal and reinforced glass, perched on a rocky outcropping overlooking a valley that locals called the Whispering Hollow. Elias had spent 15 years studying anomalous weather patterns, and he had learned to trust his instruments more than his instincts. But his instruments were currently telling him things that made no sense. "The pressure dropped 40 millibars in the last hour," he said, staring at the digital readout on his laptop. Behind him, Mara Two Feathers was studying a topographical map of the region, her finger tracing the contour lines of the surrounding mountains. She was the team's cultural liaison, a member of the Tlingit tribe with a master's in anthropology from University of Alaska, and she had been trying to tell Elias about the old stories since the day she arrived. The elders say the hollow sings before they wake, Mara said, not looking up from her map. She was 32 years old, with long black hair streaked with premature gray and eyes the color of glacier ice. They've been singing for 3 days now. The village of Klawok is already evacuating. Who is they, Mara? Elias asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. Every time I ask for specifics, I get riddles. Mara finally looked up, and Elias was struck by the fear he saw in her expression. This was a woman who had grown up in the Alaskan bush, who had faced grizzly bears and hurricane-force storms with equanimity. But now her face had gone pale beneath her copper skin. The Thunderbirds, she said softly. Not the mythological ones, not the stories for children, the real things that those stories remember. Elias was about to respond with some dismissive comment about superstition when the door to the station burst open and Kevin Park, one of the 2 graduate students, stumbled inside with rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. Kevin was 26, tech-savvy and skeptical, the kind of young researcher who delighted in debunking folklore with hard data. "You need to see this," Kevin gasped, holding up his smartphone. The screen showed a video recording. The footage was shaky, taken in the woods about half a mile from the station. "I was collecting soil samples near the ridge when I found it." He played the video. The camera panned across a section of forest floor that had been disturbed by what looked like a recent landslide. Exposed in the freshly turned earth was an object that caught the dying light of the Alaskan evening. It was roughly the size of a basketball, smooth and obsidian black. But as the camera zoomed closer, Elias could see that it wasn't quite like any stone he had ever encountered. The surface seemed to move to breathe. It wasn't rough like volcanic glass, nor was it polished like river stone. It had a texture that the camera couldn't quite capture, somewhere between liquid and solid, and as Kevin's trembling hand reached out to touch it, "Don't touch it," Mara screamed from the video, her voice distant but panicked. Elias saw that the stone was warm. Steam rose from it in the cold evening air. "It's a thunderstone," Mara said, her voice hollow. "My grandmother told me about them, the eggs of the—" "Don't say it," Elias interrupted. "Don't say Thunderbirds. I'm not dealing with cryptids today. That's probably some kind of geological anomaly, a gas pocket maybe, or thermal venting." But even as he said it, Elias knew he was lying to himself. He had seen the Wyoming crime scene photos. He had studied the forensic report on Marcus Webb's death, the fused bones, the impossible trauma, the shadow in the photograph. The FBI had buried the case, labeled it a bear attack despite the complete absence of bear DNA or claw marks, but Elias had connections in the forensic community. He knew what had really happened in that clearing. And now he was 3,000 miles away, staring at a video of a stone that pulsed like a heartbeat. "We need to contact the village," Mara said, already reaching for the satellite phone. "They need to know the eggs are hatching." "Eggs?" Kevin laughed nervously. "Mara, that's a rock, a weird rock, sure, but—" The lights in the station flickered. Outside, the wind that had been howling for hours suddenly stopped, plunging the valley into an eerie, unnatural silence. Elias felt the hair on his arms stand up, not from cold but from static electricity. The air itself seemed charged, vibrating with potential energy like the moment before a lightning strike. "Where's Jordan?" Elias asked suddenly, realizing he hadn't seen the other graduate student in hours. Jordan Reyes was Kevin's research partner, a bright young woman from New Mexico who had been studying atmospheric anomalies. She had been collecting data at the weather station 2 miles east of the main facility, a trip that should have taken her 4 hours at most. She had left at noon. It was now nearly 8 in the evening, and the Alaskan winter darkness had descended like a hammer. "She's not back," Kevin's face went pale. "She texted me at 4, said she was heading back." Elias grabbed his coat and flashlight. "Mara, you stay here and try to raise the village. Kevin, you're with me. We're going to find her." They never made it to the weather station. 20 minutes into their hike, Elia's flashlight beam caught something hanging from a spruce tree 20 feet above the forest floor. At first, he thought it was a tarp, or maybe a jacket caught on a branch. But as the beam steadied, he saw the truth, and his stomach turned to ice. It was Jordan's jacket, or rather, what remained of it. The heavy winter coat was soaked through with blood so dark it looked black in the flashlight's glow. The fabric had been shredded, torn apart by forces that had ripped through the reinforced synthetic material like it was tissue paper. And inside the jacket, still partially filling the sleeves, were Jordan's arms. Just her arms, severed at the shoulders with such force that the bone had splintered, leaving jagged white fragments protruding from the ragged meat. Her hands were still intact, still clutching the data tablet she had carried with her. The screen was cracked but active, displaying her final readings, atmospheric pressure dropping to impossible levels, temperature plummeting, electromagnetic readings off the charts. Kevin screamed. The sound was high and raw, tearing from his throat in an endless wail of denial and horror. He tried to climb the tree, to reach what was left of his friend, but his hands slipped on the blood-slick bark and he fell backward into the snow, sobbing and retching. Elias forced himself to look up to scan the branches above the jacket. He expected to see the rest of Jordan's body, or what remained of it. But there was nothing. No corpse, no blood trail, no sign of where she had gone or what had taken her. Except for the marks on the tree. 3 parallel gouges ran down the trunk, starting at 30 feet and continuing to the ground. Each gouge was 6 inches deep, cutting through bark and cambium and heartwood with surgical precision. And they weren't made by any blade Elias had ever seen. The edges were serrated, hooked, like the claw marks of some impossible bird of prey. "We need to get back to the station," Elias said, his voice sounding distant and foreign to his own ears. "Now, right now." They ran through the darkness, stumbling over roots and rocks, their flashlights bouncing wildly. Behind them, Elias heard something moving through the canopy above, heavy wing beats that displaced the air with enough force to send snow showering down from the branches. Whatever it was following them, tracking them, hurting them. When they burst through the station door, Mara was waiting with the satellite phone still in her hand and tears streaming down her face. "The village," she whispered. "They're all dead. The entire village of Klawok. Something came out of the sky and—" She stopped, her eyes going wide as she looked past Elias to the window behind him. Kevin was still screaming, a continuous, broken sound that seemed to have no end. And outside, silhouetted against the moon, something vast and winged and ancient blocked out the stars. The Thunderbird had awakened. Gus Fletcher had been flying bush planes in Alaska for 40 years, and he thought he had seen everything the wilderness could throw at a man. He had flown through whiteouts that reduced visibility to zero, landed on river ice that cracked beneath his pontoons, and once outran a forest fire so close that the paint on his fuselage had bubbled and blackened. But when Elias Veyer stumbled into his hangar at the airstrip 3 miles from the research station, babbling about giant birds and severed arms and things that shouldn't exist, Gus felt the old familiar chill of real fear creeping up his spine. "Dr. Veyer, you need to slow down," Gus said, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a tin cup and pressing it into the scientist's trembling hands. "Start from the beginning." Elias took the whiskey but didn't drink. His eyes were wild, darting around the hangar as if expecting something to burst through the corrugated metal walls at any moment. "We need to get airborne," he said, his voice cracking. "We need to see how many of them there are. We need to know what we're dealing with." Gus was 63 years old, a grizzled veteran with a gray beard stained by decades of chewing tobacco and skin like leather from the Arctic wind. He had flown for scientists before, geologists, climatologists, biologists, and he knew the type. They were rational people, grounded in data and evidence. For one of them to lose their grip on reality meant either they had truly snapped or they had seen something that genuinely defied rational explanation. My Cessna's fueled and ready, Gus said slowly. But I'm not taking her up in weather like this. Look outside, Doc, that's no natural storm. Through the hangar's open door, they could see the sky above the valley. It had turned a bruised purple color, the clouds churning in patterns that seemed almost organic, like the heaving of some vast lung. Lightning flickered within the mass, but it was the wrong color, blue-white instead of yellow, and it moved horizontally through the clouds rather than striking downward to earth. That's them, Mara said from the corner where she sat huddled in a blanket Kevin had found. The graduate student was sedated with Valium. His screaming finally stopped, but his eyes remained wide and vacant, staring at nothing. The Thunderbirds make their own storms. My grandmother said when they wake, the sky bleeds electricity. I need to see, Elias insisted. If there are more of those things out there, we need to know. The village Klawak Mara said everyone was. The radio's been dead for an hour, Gus interrupted. Can't raise anyone. Not the village, not the state troopers, not the National Guard station at Juneau. It's like the whole world's gone quiet. Then we fly, Elias said. Please, Gus, I need to see what's out there. Gus studied the scientist for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but we stick to visual flight rules. Anything funny, and I mean anything, we turn back immediately. The Cessna 185 Skywagon was an older model, built in the 1970s, but Gus had maintained her meticulously. The six-seat, high-wing aircraft was ideal for bush flying, with its rugged landing gear and powerful Continental engine. As they pushed the plane out of the hangar into the pre-dawn gloom, Gus found himself praying to gods he hadn't believed in since childhood. Mara refused to come. I'm not getting in that plane, she said, her voice flat and certain. The elders say they hunt from above. You'd be bringing them right to us. We need someone to monitor the radio, Elias argued. If we find anything, we need to be able to communicate. There's nothing to monitor, Mara said. And if you go up there won't be anyone to communicate with. You'll be dead. In the end, only Elias and Gus climbed aboard. Kevin was in no condition to move, let alone fly, and Mara flatly refused. The Cessna's engine coughed to life, propeller spinning into a silver blur, and Gus guided the plane onto the short airstrip. The takeoff was smooth, the little plane lifting into the turbulent air and climbing steadily to 500 feet. From this height, Gus could see the research station below, a tiny outpost of civilization in the vast wilderness. Beyond it, the valley stretched eastward toward the coast, and in the distance, the lights of Klawak should have been visible. Instead, there was only darkness. Christ, Gus breathed, banking the plane for a better view. Look at that. Where the village of Klawak had stood for 80 years, where 300 people had lived and worked and raised their families, there was now only scorched earth. The forest for miles around had been flattened, trees snapped and uprooted as if by a tornado of incredible force. But there was no fire, no smoke, no burning, just destruction, pure and absolute. And the bodies. Elias pressed his face against the cold window, his breath fogging the glass. He could see shapes on the ground below, dark stains against the snow. Dozens of them, hundreds. The Thunderbirds had not merely killed the villagers, they had harvested them, leaving the remains scattered across the landscape like discarded refuse. We need to get closer, Elias said. I need to document this. Are you insane? Gus snapped. I'm not taking this plane into that. Whatever did that is still out there. But even as he spoke, the sky around them darkened further. Not from clouds. The clouds were below them now, churning in their unnatural patterns, but from something else. Something above. Elias saw it first. Gus, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine's roar. Gus, look up. The pilot's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, then to the side window. What he saw made him forget how to breathe. It was descending from the cloud layer above, emerging from the purple-black storm like a demon birthing itself from nightmare. The creature's wingspan had to be 40 feet across, maybe more. The wings themselves translucent membranes stretched over bone-thin frameworks that shouldn't have been able to support such mass. The body was avian in shape but wrong in proportion, the torso bloated and distended like a tick gorged on blood. And the head. The head was the worst part. It had a beak, yes, but it was the beak of something that had never existed in nature. It curved downward in a serrated hook, lined with rows of smaller teeth that spiraled back into a throat that seemed to open into infinite darkness. Above the beak were not eyes but sockets, deep and lightless, and from them trailed streamers of some phosphorescent matter that glowed with sickly blue light. The creature's skin was mottled gray and black, covered in patches of what looked like lichen or moss, and as it descended, Gus could see that it wasn't flying so much as falling in a controlled way, gravity barely seeming to touch it. "Pull up," Elias screamed, "pull up." Gus yanked back on the yoke, the Cessna's nose climbing steeply. The little plane wasn't built for evasive maneuvers, but Gus had spent 40 years making her do things the engineers never intended. They climbed hard and fast, the engine screaming in protest. The Thunderbird shrieked. The sound was beyond description. It wasn't merely loud. It was physical, a pressure wave that hammered against the Cessna's fuselage like a giant fist. Gus felt his eardrums flex and nearly burst, and he tasted blood in his mouth from the rupture of capillaries. The plane bucked and twisted, instruments spinning wildly as electromagnetic interference surged through the systems. "It's coming around," Elias yelled. The creature had overshot them, but now it was banking in a turn that no bird should have been capable of, its vast wings catching air with impossible efficiency. Gus saw it coming in his peripheral vision, a black shape against the darker black of the storm, and he knew with absolute certainty that he wasn't going to outfly it. "Hold on," he grunted, and he did something desperate. He cut the engine. The propeller stopped spinning and the plane began to fall, dropping like a stone toward the clouds below. The Thunderbird, expecting its prey to continue climbing, shot past them in a blur of hooked talons and beating wings, so close that Gus could smell it, a scent like ozone and rotting meat and something older, something that smelled like the depths of the earth. "Restart," Elias screamed. "Restart the engine." Gus's hands were shaking so badly he could barely turn the key, but 40 years of muscle memory took over. The engine caught, coughed, died, caught again, and suddenly the propeller was spinning and they were pulling out of the dive with bare seconds to spare before they would have plunged into the storm clouds. But the Thunderbird was turning. "It's learning," Elias whispered, watching the creature pivot in midair with a grace that defied physics. "It's not just an animal, it's intelligent." The Thunderbird came at them from below this time, rising from the clouds like a missile, its beak opening wide, wider, impossibly wide until the jaws seemed to unhinge like a snake's. Gus saw the rows of teeth spiraling back into darkness, and he saw the throat muscles contracting, and he realized what was happening a split second before it did. The creature was going to swallow the plane whole. Gus wrenched the yoke sideways, the Cessna banking desperately. The Thunderbird's beak snapped shut with a sound like a thunderclap, missing the fuselage by inches. But the creature wasn't done. Its wing came up, the leading edge lined with hooked claws each the size of a machete, and it raked across the Cessna's windshield. Safety glass shattered. The windshield didn't merely crack, it disintegrated into a spray of crystalline fragments that peppered both men like buckshot. The Arctic wind roared into the cockpit, freezing Gus's hands on the yoke, tearing at his eyes. He was flying blind now, tears streaming down his face, the wind screaming in his ears. "Gus," Elias shouted, "I can't see the wind." The Thunderbird hit them again. This time it came from the side. Gus felt the impact in his very bones, the whole plane shuddering as the creature slammed into it with its body. Metal screamed. The Cessna's right wing buckled, aluminum skin peeling back like the skin of a banana, revealing the skeleton of struts and wires beneath. The fuel tank in that wing ruptured, and Gus smelled aviation gas mixing with the Arctic air. "We're going down," he screamed, fighting for control that no longer existed. "Elias, hold on, we're going down." The lake appeared below them, its frozen surface gleaming dully in the stormlight. Gus had seconds to make a decision: try to land on the ice and risk crashing through, or try to pancake into the snow on the shore. He chose the ice, leveling the plane as best he could, flaps down, nose up. They hit at 80 knots. The impact was devastating. The Cessna's landing gear snapped off like twigs, the fuselage belly flopping onto the ice with a sound like a giant drum. The plane slid, spinning, chunks of ice flying up to pepper the already damaged wings. The tail section broke away, spinning off into the darkness. The remaining fuel tank ruptured, pouring gasoline onto the ice. But they weren't sinking. The ice was holding. Gus's head rang like a bell. He felt blood pouring down his face from a gash in his forehead, and his right arm hung uselessly, the shoulder dislocated by the force of his body hitting the instrument panel. But he was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive. "Elias," he croaked, turning his head. "Elias, you okay?" The passenger seat was empty. Gus stared at the empty seatbelt, the strap still buckled but containing nothing. The wind howled through the shattered windshield, carrying snow and ice into the ruined cockpit. Elias was gone. Then Gus looked up. The Thunderbird was perched on the ice 30 yards away, its claws sunk deep into the frozen surface for traction. It was smaller than the one that had attacked the plane in the air. This one had a wingspan of maybe 20 feet, still enormous but not the barn-sized behemoth from the clouds. A juvenile, perhaps, or maybe the larger one had simply moved on. And in its beak, thrashing and screaming, was Elias. The scientist had been snatched from the cockpit during the crash, Gus realized, plucked out by the smaller Thunderbird that must have been waiting for them. The creature held him by the shoulders, its hooked beak buried deep into the meat of his upper back, and as Gus watched in frozen horror, the Thunderbird began to eat. It didn't kill him first. That was the worst part. The creature tore into Elias' back with surgical precision, its beak hook working like a can opener to peel away muscle and fascia and reveal the gleaming white vertebrae beneath. Elias was still screaming, his arms flailing uselessly, his legs kicking in the air. The Thunderbird shook him like a dog shakes a rat, and Gus heard the wet crunch of breaking bones. Then the creature bit down harder, and Elias' spine separated with a sound like a tree branch snapping under snow. The screaming stopped. The Thunderbird dropped the upper half of Elias' body onto the ice. It hit with a wet thud, trailing intestines and spinal fluid. The creature then turned its attention to the lower half still in its beak, and it began to swallow. Gus watched, paralyzed, as the creature consumed his passenger. The legs went down the gullet first, then the hips, then the abdomen. The Thunderbird's throat expanded grotesquely, the skin stretching to accommodate the bulk of the corpse. It took nearly a minute for the entire lower half of Elias' body to disappear into that maw, and when it was done, the creature turned its eyeless sockets toward the wreckage of the plane. Toward Gus. The pilot scrambled backward, away from the windshield, into the ruined cabin. His right arm was useless, but his left still worked, and he used it to drag himself toward the rear of the plane where the survival gear was stored. His fingers found the handle of the emergency axe, and he pulled it free, brandishing it with his one good hand. The Thunderbird approached the plane. Gus could hear it moving across the ice, its talons scratching and scraping. The creature wasn't flying now. Maybe it couldn't take off again until it digested its meal, or maybe it simply preferred to walk when its prey was cornered. Either way, Gus could see its shadow against the broken fuselage, growing larger closer. The axe had a 3-foot handle and a razor-sharp blade. It was meant for cutting through aluminum skin in a crash, for hacking through jungle brush if a plane went down in the Amazon. It was not meant for fighting monsters. The Thunderbird's head appeared in the shattered window. Up close, it was even more horrific. The beak was covered in Elias' blood, strips of flesh still hanging from the serrated edges. The eye sockets were deep pits that seemed to lead into another dimension, and from them, the phosphorescent tendrils waved like underwater plants. The creature had no nostrils that Gus could see, but it was sniffing somehow, its head cocking this way and that as it scented the air. "Come on," Gus whispered, raising the axe. "Come on, you ugly bastard." The Thunderbird struck. It was faster than anything had a right to be. The beak snapped forward, hooking Gus's bad arm at the shoulder, and yanked. The pilot screamed as he was dragged toward the window, his body scraping across the jagged metal of the ruined fuselage. The creature's strength was impossible. Gus was a 200-pound man, and the Thunderbird pulled him along like he weighed nothing. He swung the axe. The blade caught the Thunderbird at the base of its beak, biting into the softer flesh where the hard keratin gave way to skin. Black blood sprayed, steaming hot in the Arctic air, and the creature shrieked in pain and fury. It released Gus's arm, but instead of retreating, it lunged again. This time the beak found his chest. The hook entered just below the sternum, punching through skin and muscle with brutal efficiency. Gus felt his ribs crack, felt the beak scraping against bone as it quested inward. He swung the axe again, but his strength was failing, the blow landing weakly against the creature's skull. The Thunderbird bit down. Gus felt his ribcage splay open, felt his lungs exposed to the freezing air. He felt the creature's secondary teeth scraping across his heart, felt the moment when the organ was pierced and squeezed and finally burst like a grape in a vise. Blood filled his mouth, his throat, his lungs. He was drowning in his own essence, his life pumping out of him in arterial spurts. The last thing he saw was the Thunderbird's throat opening above him, the spiral of teeth descending to finish what they had started. The last thing he felt was the creature's tongue, rough and barbed, scraping across his exposed heart. Then there was only darkness and the sound of feeding. Elias didn't die when his spine was severed. The Thunderbird had been precise, almost surgical in its bite. The creature knew anatomy, knew how to keep prey alive for the longest possible time. Elias' heart still beat, his brain still functioned, his nerves still screamed. He lay on the ice in two pieces, his upper body separated from his legs by a gap of 3 feet, and he could feel everything. He could feel the cold seeping into his exposed spinal cord, the Arctic air touching nerves that were never meant to be exposed to the world. He could feel his blood pumping out of him, each heartbeat weaker than the last, his life draining onto the ice in a spreading pool of crimson. He could feel his intestines spilling from his abdomen, the cold loops of bowel steaming faintly in the freezing air. And he could feel the Thunderbird eating his legs. The creature had settled down on the ice 20 feet away, using its claws to hold the lower half of Elias' body in place while it tore off manageable chunks. It started with the feet, each toe bitten off individually, the bones crunched like celery sticks. Then it moved up to the ankles, stripping away flesh and tendon to reveal the joint structures beneath. The creature seemed fascinated by the knees, turning them over in its beak, examining the ball-and-socket mechanisms with what might have been curiosity. Elias watched it all. He couldn't look away. His upper body was propped against the side of the wrecked plane, his arms too weak to move, his head lolling on a neck that no longer had the support of a complete spine. He was dying, he knew, but slowly. The cold would kill him before the blood loss did, eventually. Hypothermia would set in, his core temperature would drop, and he would drift away. But that would take hours, and the Thunderbird was eating his legs much faster than that. When the creature reached his pelvis, Elias finally passed out. The pain was simply too much, the horror too complete. His mind retreated into darkness, into unconsciousness, into the merciful void where there were no monsters and no pain. He woke again to the sensation of being moved. The Thunderbird had finished with his lower half, Nothing remained but scattered bones and fragments of flesh, and it had turned its attention to the upper portion. It gripped him by the shoulders, its talons piercing through his coat and into the meat beneath, and it lifted him into the air. Elias screamed then, the sound bubbling from his lips in a spray of blood and froth. The creature ignored him, spreading its wings, and with 3 powerful beats it was airborne, carrying its still-living prey into the storm. The wind tore at Elias' exposed organs, freezing them solid in seconds. His dangling spinal cord whipped in the gale, the nerves already dead from cold but the sensation still somehow registering. He looked down and saw the plain wreckage shrinking below, the frozen lake, the dark expanse of forest, and beyond it the scorched earth where Klawok had once stood. They climbed higher, the Thunderbird's wings beating steadily, carrying them up into the purple-black clouds where the other creatures waited. Elias could see them now, dozens of them, their vast shapes silhouetted against the lightning. The Thunderbirds were nesting in the storm itself, using the electrical energy for some unknowable purpose, their bodies crackling with static that discharged in miniature lightning bolts across their wings. The creature carrying him dove toward the largest of the Thunderbirds. This was the Alpha, the one that had attacked the plane. It was enormous, its wingspan easily 60 feet across, its body so bloated and distended that Elias couldn't understand how it stayed aloft. The Alpha's eye sockets fixed on him as he approached, and he felt a pressure in his mind, a presence that was ancient and hungry and utterly alien. The smaller Thunderbird dropped him. Elias fell through the air, tumbling end over end, his separated spine flopping uselessly. He expected to hit the ground, to die on impact, to end this nightmare of pain and horror. Instead, he fell into the Alpha's beak. The creature caught him with surgical precision, the hook of its beak entering through his open abdominal cavity and exiting through his back. Elias was impaled, hanging there like a piece of meat on a spit, his arms and legs flailing weakly. The Alpha lifted him up, until he was level with those empty eye sockets. And then it began to feed. The Alpha didn't bite, it didn't tear. It simply held him there, impaled on its beak, and Elias felt something worse than teeth. He felt suction. The creature was drinking him somehow, pulling the fluids from his body through his wounds, through his exposed organs, through every orifice and opening. His blood flowed upward, defying gravity, disappearing into the creature's throat. His spinal fluid was extracted in a steady stream, his eyeballs deflating as the vitreous humor was drawn out. His brain itself began to liquefy, the pressure difference sucking the gray matter through the fractures in his skull. It took hours. The Alpha was in no hurry. It consumed Elias piece by piece, cell by cell, keeping him conscious through some horrible biological mechanism that prevented shock and maintained awareness. Elias felt every moment of it, every extraction, every liquefaction, every dissolution of self. When there was nothing left but skin and bone, the Alpha finally bit down. The skull cracked like an egg, and the last of Elias' veer disappeared into the darkness of the Thunderbird's gullet. The Alpha raised its head to the storm and screamed. The sound was thunder. It was the end of the world. It was the voice of something that had been old when the continents were young, something that had watched the rise and fall of civilizations, something that was hungry and would always be hungry. And as the scream echoed across the Alaskan wilderness, a dozen smaller Thunderbirds answered, their cries joining into a chorus of hunger that would soon descend upon the world of men. Mara Two Feathers heard the screams from 5 miles away. She was standing in the doorway of the research station, Kevin unconscious at her feet from a sedative she'd found in the medical kit, when the sound rolled across the valley like thunder. It wasn't the explosion of the Cessna hitting the lake. She would have recognized that sound. This was something else, something organic and vast, and filled with such malevolent hunger that she felt her knees weaken and her vision tunnel. The scream went on for nearly a minute, a continuous undulating wail that seemed to make the very air vibrate. When it finally faded, Mara realized she was crying, tears freezing on her cheeks in the Arctic wind. She knew what that sound meant. The alpha had fed. The alpha was strong. The alpha was ready to breed. "We need to move," she whispered to herself, shaking off the paralysis of fear. "We need to move now." She dragged Kevin's unconscious form back into the station, securing him to the bunk with restraints she found in the supply closet. She couldn't carry him, and she couldn't leave him behind. The Thunderbirds hunted movement, hunted sound, hunted heat. If Kevin stayed quiet and still, he might survive. Might. She grabbed what supplies she could fit in a backpack: matches, lighter fluid, protein bars, a flare gun, her grandmother's knife. The knife was old, the handle carved from caribou antler, the blade made of obsidian that had been knapped by her great-grandmother's hands. It wasn't much of a weapon against creatures that could tear apart airplanes, but it was all she had. She also took the Thunderstone. It was still sitting where Kevin had left it, on the table in the center of the main room. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic warmth that matched the beating of her own heart. Mara didn't want to touch it. The story said the stones were alive, that they were the eggs of the Thunderbirds, that they would hatch if given enough time and heat. But she also knew that the stones were the only thing that could kill the creatures. Her grandmother had told her that much. "The stones are their hearts," the old woman had whispered decades ago when Mara was small and the stories were just stories. "Break the stone, break the heart, but be careful, little one. The stones remember. They remember everything." Mara wrapped the Thunderstone in her coat and shoved it in her pack. Then she opened the station door and stepped out into the freezing darkness. She knew where to go. There was an abandoned mine 3 miles northeast, a copper mine that had been worked in the 1920s and then abandoned when the vein played out. The local Tlingit had avoided the area for generations, calling it the place where the sky touches earth, claiming it was a Thunderbird nesting ground. The mining company had ignored the warnings, of course, and 23 men had died in the collapse of 1924. The official report cited structural failure. The unofficial story spoke of something that had emerged from the deep tunnels, something that had been sleeping. Mara had visited the mine once as part of her research for the cultural liaison position. She remembered the way the air had felt inside, thick and heavy and charged with static. She remembered the walls, how they had seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. And she remembered the smell, ozone and rotting meat and something else, something ancient and hungry. If the Thunderbirds had a nest in this region, it would be there. She moved through the forest like a ghost, placing each footstep with care, making no sound. The Tlingit had taught her how to walk silently, how to become part of the landscape rather than an intruder upon it. She didn't use her flashlight. The moon was bright enough and light would attract the creatures. She navigated by instinct and memory, by the feel of the land beneath her feet. She heard them overhead sometimes. The beat of vast wings, the creak of bone and tendon, the occasional shriek that split the air like lightning. They were hunting, searching for more prey. She wondered if they had found Elias and Gus yet, if they were even now consuming them, adding their strength to the Alpha's power. She reached the mine entrance after an hour of careful travel. The wooden support beams were rotted, the tracks overgrown with moss and spruce saplings, but the tunnel mouth gaped open like a wound in the earth. From inside, Mara could hear a sound like drums, like heartbeats, like thunder rolling through stone. She also heard something else, something that sounded like weeping. Mara drew her grandmother's knife and stepped into the darkness. The tunnel sloped downward at a steep angle, descending into the earth at a grade that would have been treacherous even with proper lighting. Mara felt her way along the walls, the stone strangely warm beneath her fingertips. The pulsing light she had remembered was stronger now, emanating from veins of some phosphorescent mineral that threaded through the rock like arteries. The weeping grew louder as she descended. It was a human sound, high and broken and filled with pain. Mara tried to remember who had been missing: Jordan Reyes, the graduate student who had gone to check the weather station and never returned. Could she have survived? Could she have made it here to the mine somehow? Mara rounded a corner, and the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. She had found the nest. The cavern was easily the size of a football field, the ceiling lost in darkness far above. The walls were studded with thunderstones, hundreds of them, thousands, embedded in the rock like malignant tumors. They pulsed in unison, casting a sickly blue-white glow across the chamber that made Mara's eyes water and her skin crawl. But the stones weren't the worst part. The floor of the chamber was carpeted with bones. Human bones, animal bones, the remains of creatures that Mara didn't recognize. They were piled in drifts, some still articulated, others scattered and shattered. She could see skulls by the dozens, femurs and ribs and vertebrae, all picked clean and bleached white by the phosphorescent glow. And in the center of the chamber, suspended from the ceiling by ropes of dried sinew and tendon, were the living. There were 6 of them. Mara recognized Jordan immediately, or what had become of her. The graduate student had been transformed, her body twisted and reshaped into something that was neither human nor bird but a grotesque amalgamation of both. Feathers sprouted from her skin in patches, emerging from pores that had dilated into gaping holes. Her arms had elongated, the bones stretching until they were twice their normal length, and her fingers had fused and sharpened into crude talons. Her jaw hung slack, unhinged like a snake's, and when she turned her head to look at Mara, her eyes were empty sockets filled with the same phosphorescent light that shone from the thunderstones. "They're hungry," Jordan whispered, her voice a rasp of damaged vocal cords. "They're always hungry, and they're learning. They're learning how to make more of themselves." Mara stared in horror at the other figures suspended from the ceiling. Some were fresh, still recognizable as human, still struggling weakly against their bonds. Others were further along in the transformation, their bodies contorted, their skin feathering, their jaws unhinging. And at the center of it all, directly beneath the largest cluster of thunderstones, was the Alpha's primary victim, a human body so transformed that only fragments of the original remained, recognizable only by the tattered remnants of clothing that still clung to the creature's bloated form. It was Elias, or what was left of him. The Thunderbird had not merely eaten him, it had remade him, using his biomass as raw material for something new. His torso had been hollowed out and filled with thunderstones, the stones embedded in his flesh like eggs in a nest. His limbs had been extended, jointed backwards, covered in gray-black feathers that were not yet fully formed. His head had been twisted around to face backwards, and from his mouth extended a beak in waiting, a hooked protuberance of bone and keratin that was still growing, still hardening. He was still alive. Mara could see his chest rising and falling, could hear the wet bubbling of his breath. The transformation kept its victims conscious, kept them aware, as they were slowly converted from human to monster. "Kill me," Elias rasped, his voice barely human. "Please kill me." Mara raised her grandmother's knife, but before she could take a step forward, the chamber filled with sound. The shrieking was everywhere, coming from all directions at once. Mara spun around, her knife held out defensively, and saw the shadows moving on the walls. They were emerging from the darkness, from cracks in the stone, from the thunderstones themselves. Dozens of them, hundreds, their eyeless sockets fixed on her, their beaks clicking in anticipation. The hunt was over, the prey had come to them. Mara did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed the thunderstone from her pack, held it high, and smashed it against the cavern wall. The explosion was instantaneous and devastating. The thunderstone didn't merely break, it detonated, releasing a blast of electrical energy that lit up the chamber like the heart of a star. Mara was thrown backward, her body hitting the stone floor with bone-jarring force. Thunderbird shrieks filled the air, high and panicked, as the energy wave swept through the nest. The creatures convulsed, their bodies racked by the electricity, their wings beating uselessly against the stone. Mara saw Jordan fall from her suspension, hitting the ground with a wet crunch. She saw Elia's transformed body twitch and spasm, the thunderstones in his chest glowing brighter and brighter until they began to crack. Mara scrambled to her feet, her vision blurry, her ears ringing. She had seconds, maybe less, before the creatures recovered. She needed to get out, needed to run, needed to. A shadow fell over her. The Alpha had arrived. It descended from the darkness above, its vast wings blocking out the phosphorescent light, its beak opening wide enough to swallow a car. Mara looked up into those empty eye sockets and felt the same pressure on her mind that Elia's had described, the ancient intelligence probing her thoughts, her memories, her fears. She knew what it wanted. It wanted her to transform, to become another host for its brood. It wanted her body to incubate its young, her consciousness to be preserved and twisted into something that would serve the nest. The Thunderbirds didn't just eat their prey. They consumed them, absorbed them, added them to the collective that was the flock. Mara wouldn't let that happen. She still had the lighter fluid. She still had the matches. And she was standing in a chamber filled with thunderstones, each one a potential bomb. The Alpha struck. Its beak came down with the speed of a striking snake, and Mara threw herself sideways, feeling the wind of its passage against her face. The beak hit the stone floor where she had been standing, cracking the rock, sending fragments flying like shrapnel. One caught her in the cheek, opening a gash that poured blood into her eyes. She couldn't see. She wiped at her face with her sleeve, clearing the blood, and saw the Alpha drawing back for another strike. Around it, the lesser Thunderbirds were recovering from the electrical blast, shaking off the effects, their eyeless sockets turning toward her. Mara made her decision. She wasn't going to survive this, but she could take them with her. She pulled the lighter fluid from her pack and began spraying the walls, the floor, the thunderstones themselves. The Alpha screamed and lunged, but Mara was already moving, dancing between the creature's talons, dodging the snapping beak. She ducked under its wing, feeling the membrane brush against her back, and she kept spraying, coating everything in the pungent liquid. The Alpha whirled, surprisingly agile for its size, and its wing caught Mara a glancing blow. She flew across the chamber, hitting the wall hard enough to crack ribs. She felt something break inside her, felt the wet filling of her lungs as blood began to pool. She couldn't breathe properly, each inhale a struggle, each exhale spraying flecks of crimson. But she still had the matches. The Alpha loomed over her, its beak opening, the spiral of teeth inside rotating like a drill. Mara could smell its breath, ozone and rotting meat, and the chemical stink of the thunderstones. She could see the patterns on its beak, the marks that looked like writing in some alien language. She could see the holes in its eye sockets, and in the depths of those holes she saw stars. "For my grandmother," she whispered, and she struck the match. The fire was instant and absolute. The lighter fluid ignited in a wave of flame that swept across the chamber, touching off the thunderstones like a chain of bombs. The first explosion threw Mara against the wall again, breaking more ribs, maybe her spine. The second explosion collapsed part of the ceiling, tons of rock falling onto the nest below. The third, fourth, fifth explosions merged into a continuous roar of flame and sound and death. The Alpha screamed. It was a sound of pure agony, of ancient power facing its end. The creature thrashed in the flames, its wings catching fire, its feathers burning like torches. It tried to fly, tried to escape, but the explosions kept coming, each thunderstone detonating and sending shards of shrapnel flying through the air. Mara saw one of those shards take the Alpha in the throat. She saw black blood spray, saw the creature's head loll back, saw it fall to the burning floor with a crash that shook the entire mine. She saw the lesser Thunderbirds burning, screaming, their bodies convulsing as the fire consumed them. She saw Jordan's transformed body twitch once and then be still. She saw Elia's monstrous form collapse, the thunderstones in his chest cracking and dissolving. And then she saw nothing at all. The ceiling came down and the world went black. Elias woke to pain. It was everywhere, in every nerve, every cell, every thought. He was burning and freezing and being torn apart all at once. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't feel his body. He was just pain, just agony, just the endless scream of a consciousness that refused to die. He remembered the plane crash. He remembered being pulled from the wreckage by the Thunderbird, being carried into the sky. He remembered the Alpha's beak, the impalement, the feeding. He remembered his body being liquefied and consumed, his brain being extracted through his eye sockets, his very essence being drained away. But he hadn't died. The Alpha had kept him alive, kept him conscious, preserved his mind even as it destroyed his body. It had been using him as a template, studying human anatomy so it could create more like him, more transformed ones, more hosts for the Thunderstones. And now he was in the dark, in the pain, in the fire. He realized slowly, agonizingly, that he could feel his body again. Not his original body, that was gone, consumed, destroyed, but something else. Something that had been built from the remains, from the bones and blood and DNA that the Alpha had preserved. He had hands again, but they were wrong, too many fingers, joints bending in the wrong directions. He had eyes, but they saw in spectrums that no human eye could perceive. He had a mouth, but it opened sideways, and when he tried to scream, the sound that came out was the shriek of a thunderbird. He was one of them now, transformed, changed, made into a monster. But underneath the transformation, underneath the feathers and the hooked beak and the eyeless sockets, there was still something human, something that remembered being Dr. Elias Weyer, climatologist, skeptic, rational man of science, something that hated what it had become. Elias used that hate. He used it to move, to crawl, to drag his transformed body through the burning wreckage of the nest. He couldn't see the other Thunderbirds, couldn't tell if they were alive or dead. He could only feel the heat and the pressure and the weight of the collapsed mine pressing down on him. He crawled for what felt like hours, maybe days. Time had no meaning in the dark. He crawled until he felt cold air on his feathers, until he smelled pine and snow and the clean scent of the Arctic wind. He crawled until his clawed hands found the surface of the earth, until he was dragging himself out of the mine entrance and into the freezing night. The world had changed. The sky was lightening in the east, the sun beginning to rise. The storm had passed, the clouds dispersing, the lightning faded. The Thunderbirds were gone, dead or fled. Elias didn't know. All he knew was that he was alone, transformed, a monster in human skin. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in gray-black feathers, the fingers elongated into talons. He touched his face and felt the beak, the hard keratin that had replaced his jaw. He was a horror, an abomination, a thing that should not exist. But he was alive, and he was still human enough to want revenge. He stumbled through the forest, moving on instinct, following the pull of the highway that he knew lay to the south. He moved by day, hiding in the shadows, afraid of being seen. He killed when he had to, a moose, a bear, once a hunter who stumbled upon him and died before he could scream. He drank their blood, ate their flesh, and each meal made him stronger, made the transformation more complete. By the time he reached the highway, he was no longer sure if any part of the man named Elias Weyer remained. He walked onto the asphalt at dusk, his transformed body casting a long shadow in the dying light. A car approached, headlights blazing, and Elias raised his hand to signal for help. The driver saw him, saw the feathers, the beak, the eyeless sockets, and swerved wildly. The car went off the road, tumbling down an embankment, and Elias heard the screams of the passengers as they died in the wreck. He didn't go to help them, he just kept walking. Hours later, or maybe days, he stumbled into a town. Lights, buildings, the sounds of civilization. He collapsed in the parking lot of a gas station, his body finally giving out, his transformation complete. When he woke, he was surrounded by police officers. They were shouting at him, pointing guns, screaming into radios. Elias tried to speak, tried to explain, but all that came out was a shriek. They tased him. He barely felt it. They shot him, the bullets punching through his feathers and embedding in the muscle beneath. He felt the wounds healing almost instantly, the bullets being pushed out by regenerating tissue. They brought him to a hospital. They chained him to a bed. They brought in doctors who poked and prodded and took samples that made no sense. They brought in scientists who whispered about cryptids and anomalous biology and possible extraterrestrial origin. Elias didn't care. He just wanted to die. He wanted the pain to end, wanted the memories to fade, wanted to stop being this thing that he had become. But they wouldn't let him die. They kept him alive, studied him, experimented on him. And one day a woman came to see him, a forensic photographer from Wyoming with haunted eyes and trembling hands. "Dr. Veyer," she said, sliding a file across the table to where his chained hands could reach it. "My name is Sarah Chen. I think we need to talk about what you saw in Alaska, and I think you need to see what I've found." Elias opened the file with his taloned fingers. Inside were crime scene photos, dozens of them, all showing the same thing. Bodies fused with pine needles, ribs splayed like wings, shadows in the sky. And in each photo, the same talon marks, the same evidence of something that had descended from the clouds to feed. 7 crime scenes across the Rockies, 7 clusters of Thunderbird activity, 7 nests waiting to hatch. Sarah slid one more photo across the table. It was an aerial shot taken by a drone over the Alaskan wilderness. It showed the collapsed mine, the scorched earth, the devastation that Mara had wrought. And rising from the center of the destruction, barely visible in the smoke and ruin, was a shape. A vast winged shape. "The Alpha survived," Sarah whispered. "It's wounded, but it's alive, and it's calling the others. The storm is gathering again, Dr. Veyer, and this time there's no one to stop it." Elias looked at the photo. He looked at Sarah. And for the first time since his transformation, he felt something other than pain and horror. He felt purpose. He would hunt them. He would find the Alpha, find the nests, destroy the Thunderstones. He was one of them now, in body if not in mind. He could sense them, could feel their hunger, could track them through the storms they created. He would be the weapon that destroyed them, the monster that killed monsters. "I'll find it," he rasped, his voice a guttural growl that was barely human. "I'll find them all, and I'll make them pay for what they did to me." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Then let's begin." They left the hospital that night, slipping away into the darkness. Behind them the sky was clear, the stars bright and cold. But on the horizon, clouds were gathering. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no storm had been forecast. Somewhere in a cave high in the Rockies, the Alpha was healing. Its wounds were closing, its strength returning, and it was dreaming of the feast to come. The sky would scream again, soon, but this time someone would be waiting to scream back. The abandoned copper mine had collapsed completely, the entrance buried under thousands of tons of rock and earth. From the air, it looked like a scar on the landscape, a place where something had torn its way out of the ground and left devastation in its wake. Sarah Chen circled the site in the chartered helicopter, her camera clicking steadily, documenting every detail of the destruction. "This is where it happened," she asked over the intercom. Elias, or what remained of him, nodded his feathered head. He couldn't speak in the helicopter's noise, but he could point. His taloned finger indicated the pattern of fallen trees, the scorch marks on the stone, the places where the thunderstones had detonated and left glassy craters in the permafrost. "The Alpha was wounded," Sarah said, reviewing her notes, "but not killed. You think it's still in there?" Elias shook his head. He had felt the creature's presence in the weeks since the destruction of the nest, felt it moving through the atmosphere like a pressure system, gathering strength. The Alpha was healing, yes, but it wasn't hiding. It was preparing, calling others of its kind from their centuries-long hibernation, rousing them from caves and mountain peaks, and the depths of the ocean where they had slept since before human memory. The Thunderbirds were waking, all of them. The helicopter banked sharply as the pilot reacted to something in the sky ahead. What the hell is that? Sarah pressed her face against the window, squinting against the glare of the sun. There was something there, barely visible, a distortion in the air like heat shimmer over desert sand. But this wasn't heat. This was something else, something vast. "Pull up," Elias screamed, his voice a harsh shriek that cut through the engine noise. "Pull up now." The pilot yanked on the controls, the helicopter climbing steeply. A moment later, the space they had occupied was filled with something massive and dark, a wing that passed through the air with enough force to buffet the helicopter like a toy. Sarah saw it clearly as it banked away, preparing for another pass. It was smaller than the Alpha had been, but still enormous, a wingspan of 30 feet, maybe more. The creature's body was sleeker, more streamlined, the bloated torso of the Alpha replaced by corded muscle and dense bone. This was a hunter, a scout, one of the first to answer the Alpha's call. And it wasn't alone. "How many are there?" Sarah whispered, counting the shadows in the sky. Elias didn't answer. He was staring at the horizon, his eyeless sockets somehow seeing something that Sarah couldn't. There were more coming, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The sky was filling with shapes, with shadows, with the beating of wings that sounded like distant thunder. "We need to get down," Elias said, his voice strained. "We need to find cover now." The pilot didn't need to be told twice. He brought the helicopter down in a clearing, setting down hard enough to bounce them in their seats. Before the rotors had even stopped spinning, Elias was out the door, dragging Sarah with him. "Run," he screamed. "Into the trees, move." They ran, the pilot close behind, stumbling through the undergrowth as the sky above filled with shrieking. The Thunderbirds were diving, the first of them already reaching the clearing where the helicopter sat. Sarah heard metal scream, heard the helicopter being torn apart, heard the wet sounds of feeding. The pilot wasn't fast enough. A shadow fell over him, and he looked up just in time to see the beak descending. It took him in the chest, lifting him off his feet, and Sarah watched in horror as the creature shook him like a terrier shakes a rat. Blood sprayed in an arc, arterial red against the white snow. The pilot's arms flailed uselessly, his legs kicking, his screams becoming gurgles as his lungs filled with blood. Then the beak bit down, and the screaming stopped. Sarah ran faster, her heart hammering, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Elias was ahead of her, moving with inhuman speed on his transformed legs, his wings, small, stunted things that had grown since his transformation, flaring out for balance. "This way," he called, veering toward a rock formation. They squeezed into a crevice in the stone, a narrow gap barely wide enough for Elias' altered form. Sarah pressed herself against the cold rock, feeling the vibrations as the Thunderbird swept overhead, searching for them. "They'll find us," she whispered. "They always find their prey." "Not if I can help it," Elias said. He reached into a pocket of his coat. He still wore the coat, despite the feathers that covered his body, despite the beak that had replaced his face, and pulled out something that glowed with a faint blue light. It was a thunderstone, but different from the ones in the mine. This one was small, barely the size of a golf ball, and it pulsed with a steady, rhythmic warmth that matched the beating of Elias' heart. "Where did you get that?" Sarah demanded. "I pulled it from my own chest," Elias said quietly. "While I was transforming, it's how they reproduce, Sarah. They don't lay eggs. They convert other life forms into hosts, and the hosts grow the stones inside them. I have one. I'm a living thunderstone." Sarah stared at him in horror. "That's how you've been sensing them. That's how you can track them." "Yes, and it's how I'm going to kill them." He closed his taloned hand around the stone. The glow intensified, and Sarah felt the air around them begin to charge with static electricity. The thunderstone was reacting to something, resonating with the other stones in the Thunderbirds above. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked. "Calling them," Elias said, "all of them." He opened his hand, and the stone blazed with light, a beacon that pierced the clouds and illuminated the sky. The thunderbirds above shrieked, a chorus of rage and hunger that made the rock around them vibrate. "Are you insane?" Sarah screamed. "You're drawing them right to us." "No," Elias said, his eyeless sockets fixed on the sky. "I'm drawing them to me." The first thunderbird found the crevice within seconds. It landed hard, its talons scraping against the stone, its beak probing the narrow gap. Sarah could see it clearly, could count the individual teeth in its spiraling maw, could smell the ozone and rotting meat on its breath. Elias stepped forward. He reached out with his transformed hand and touched the creature's beak. The thunderstone in his chest blazed. The energy that surged from Elias' body was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. It wasn't electricity, not exactly, though it crackled and sparked like lightning. It was something older, something that had existed before electricity, before fire, before light itself. It was the raw power of the storm, concentrated and focused through the conduit of Elias' transformed body. The thunderbird convulsed. Its feathers stood on end, its muscles locking in spasm. It tried to pull away, but Elias held on, his talons digging into the creature's beak, his body channeling more and more energy into the contact. "Die," Elias whispered. "Die, you bastard, die." The thunderbird exploded. It didn't merely die. It detonated, its body vaporizing in a flash of light and heat that threw Elias backward and sent Sarah tumbling deeper into the crevice. The shockwave rippled through the stone, cracking the rock, showering them with debris. When Sarah crawled back to the entrance, coughing dust, she saw Elias lying on his back, his body smoking, his feathers singed and blackened. The thunderbird was gone, reduced to ash and fragments of bone that were already being scattered by the wind. "Elias?" Sarah scrambled to him, checking for a pulse. "Elias, are you?" "Alive," he croaked. "Barely. That took more than I thought it would." "You killed it," Sarah said, hardly believing it. "You actually killed one." "One," Elias agreed, struggling to sit up. "But there are more coming, many more. And I can only do that once, maybe twice more before the stone is depleted, and then I'll be just like them, mindless, hungry." Sarah helped him to his feet. Above them, the sky was darkening, the thunderbirds gathering in a swirling mass that blocked out the sun. There were hundreds of them now, their vast wings creating a hurricane of wind that tore at the trees and sent boulders rolling down the mountainside. "We can't fight them all," Sarah said. "No," Elias agreed. "But we can find the alpha, kill the alpha, and the rest might scatter. They have a hive mind, Sarah. They think together, act together. Without the alpha, they're just animals." "And where is the alpha?" Elias pointed. "There." Sarah followed his gaze. In the center of the swirling mass of thunderbirds, barely visible through the storm of wings and talons, was a shape that dwarfed even the largest of the hunters. It was the size of a small building, its wingspan so vast that it cast a shadow across the entire valley. The alpha had healed, the alpha had grown, and the alpha was leading its brood to war. "How do we get to it?" Sarah asked. "We don't," Elias said. "I do, alone." "Like hell you do," Sarah snapped. "I've been tracking these things since before you became one of them. I'm not letting you go up there alone." "You'll die," Elias said flatly. "Then I'll die, but I'm not staying behind." Elias studied her for a long moment, his eyeless sockets somehow conveying an expression of sorrow and respect. "You remind me of Mara," he said quietly. "She was brave too, stupid but brave." "I'm not stupid," Sarah said. "I'm just not afraid to die, not if it means stopping these things." "Then come," Elias said, extending his hand. "But know this, once we start, there's no turning back. We either kill the alpha or we become part of its nest. Those are the only options." Sarah took his hand. His talons were warm, the texture of his skin strange and alien. But his grip was firm, and she felt a pulse of energy from the thunderstone in his chest, resonating with something in her own body. "What was that?" she asked. "The stone recognizes you," Elias said. "It thinks you're a host, a vessel. Be careful, Sarah. If I die, it might try to convert you." "Then don't die," Sarah said. They climbed out of the crevice, moving carefully across the scree slope toward the edge of the forest. The thunderbirds above were circling now, waiting for something, waiting for the Alpha's command. The command came as a shriek that shattered the air like a sonic boom. Sarah felt her eardrums flex, felt blood trickle from her nose, felt the pressure in her skull build to the point of bursting. Around them, trees snapped, their trunks cracked by the sound wave, their branches raining down like matchsticks. "It's calling them to feed," Elias screamed over the fading echoes. "It's starting the harvest." The thunderbird's dove. They came from all directions at once, a storm of beaks and talons and eyeless hunger. Sarah and Elias ran, dodging between trees, using the forest as cover. Behind them, the thunderbirds struck, their talons shredding bark and flesh alike, their beaks punching through trunks to impale whatever hid behind. A tree exploded next to Sarah, splinters driving into her arm, her side, her face. She screamed and kept running. A thunderbird passed overhead, close enough that she felt the wind of its wings, smelled the ozone on its feathers. Its shadow passed over her, and she waited for the impact, for the talons to seize her, for the beak to tear her apart. It didn't come. The creature swept past, targeting something else, something behind her. Sarah risked a glance back and saw what had saved her. Elias had stopped. He was standing in the open, his arms spread wide, the thunderstone in his chest blazing like a star. The thunderbird had turned toward him, drawn by the light, by the promise of a host that was already prepared. "Elias, no," Sarah screamed. "Keep running," he called back. "Find the Alpha, I'll hold them off." "You can't fight them all." "I don't need to fight them, I just need to give you time. Go, Sarah, now." She wanted to argue, wanted to drag him away, wanted to find another way. But the thunderbirds were already landing around him, dozens of them, their beaks clicking, their eyeless sockets fixed on the glowing stone in his chest. They were curious, cautious. They knew he was one of them, but different, changed, a rogue element in their hive mind. Sarah ran. She ran through the forest, away from Elias, away from the horde of thunderbirds that were gathering around him. She ran toward the edge of the valley, toward the place where the Alpha hung in the sky like a storm cloud made flesh. She was alone now, truly alone, and the Alpha was waiting. It descended as she reached the valley floor, its vast wings beating once, twice, creating gusts of wind that knocked her off her feet. She tumbled in the snow, rolling, trying to find her footing, her camera lost, her notebook gone, only the knife in her belt and the will to survive keeping her moving. The Alpha landed. The impact shook the earth, a tremor that traveled through the permafrost and made the ground buckle and crack. Sarah sprawled on her back, staring up at the creature that loomed over her. It was even larger up close. Its body was a mountain of gray-black flesh, bloated and distended, covered in patches of lichen and moss that seemed to writhe with independent life. Its wings, folded now, were vast membranes stretched over frameworks of bone that looked like the ribs of some impossible cathedral. And its head. The head was a nightmare of evolution gone wrong. The beak was larger than a canoe, curved and serrated, dripping with black fluid that steamed in the cold air. Above the beak, the eye sockets were deep pits of absolute darkness, and from them trailed streamers of phosphorescent matter that lit the creature's face in shades of blue and green. The Alpha lowered its head, its beak hovering inches from Sarah's face. She could see her reflection in the black keratin, could see the terror in her own eyes. She could smell the creature's breath, ancient, hungry, filled with the scent of countless meals across countless centuries. "I know you," the Alpha whispered. Sarah froze. The voice was in her head, not her ears, a pressure against her consciousness that felt like drowning. But it was unmistakable. The Alpha was speaking to her. "I know you're kind," the voice continued, resonating through her skull like a bell. You are the photographers, the documenters, the ones who capture images and call them truth. You think that by recording us, you can understand us. You think that understanding will give you power. Sarah couldn't move. She was paralyzed, held in place by the alpha's gaze, by the pressure of its mind against hers. But you are wrong, the voice said. We cannot be understood. We are beyond your comprehension. We were old when your kind was young. We were hungry when your kind was still crawling in the mud. We are the storm. We are the thunder. We are the end of all things. The beak opened, the jaws unhinging, the spiral of teeth inside rotating slowly. Sarah could see down the creature's throat, could see the darkness that waited there, the endless hunger. And now, the alpha whispered, you will become part of us. Your knowledge will become our knowledge. Your memories will become our memories. You will live forever, Sarah Chen, forever in the storm. The beak descended and stopped. A shriek of agony split the air, and Sarah felt the pressure on her mind release. She scrambled backward, looking up, and saw something impossible. Elias was on the alpha's back. He had climbed the creature's body somehow, had scaled the mountain of flesh using his talons and his inhuman strength. He was perched on the alpha's neck, his hands buried in the creature's feathers, and he was screaming, a sound of rage and pain and defiance that matched the alpha's own shrieks. Sarah, he screamed. The stone, in my chest, pull it out. What? Pull it out, use it, kill us both, Sarah understood. The thunderstone in Elia's chest was still resonating, still glowing, still connected to the alpha through the hive mind. If she could remove it, could use its energy as a weapon. She ran forward, ignoring the alpha's thrashing, ignoring the wings that were spreading, preparing to take flight. She climbed onto the creature's body, her fingers finding purchase in the gaps between feathers, her boots slipping on the slick, warm flesh. The alpha bucked, trying to throw her off. Elias held on, his talons locked in the creature's neck, his body being battered by the spasms of the giant bird. Hurry, he screamed. It's waking up, it's... The alpha's head snapped around, the beak striking Elias in the side. Sarah heard ribs crack, heard Elias scream of pain, saw blood spray across the gray-black feathers, but he didn't let go. Sarah, now. She reached the spot where his chest should be, where the thunderstone glowed brightest. The feathers there were sparse, the skin thinner, and she could see the stone beneath, pulsing like a heart. She grabbed it. The shock was immediate and devastating. Energy surged through her body, filling her with power she couldn't comprehend, couldn't control. She felt the hive mind, felt the thousands of Thunderbirds that were connected through the alpha, felt their hunger and their ancient patience and their endless, eternal need to feed. Use it, Elias screamed. Use it to kill them, Sarah pulled. The stone came free with a wet, sucking sound, trailing threads of flesh and blood. It blazed in her hand, brighter than the sun, hotter than fire. She raised it over her head, feeling the energy building, feeling the storm gathering. I'm sorry, she whispered. She brought the stone down on the alpha's skull. The explosion was silent at first. A sphere of light expanded from the point of impact, growing, consuming, obliterating everything it touched. Sarah felt herself being thrown backward, felt the heat washing over her, felt her clothes igniting and her skin burning. Then the sound came, thunder, the end of the world, the scream of a dying god. The alpha's shriek was the last thing Sarah heard before the light took her. When she woke, she was lying in a crater. The snow around her had melted, then refrozen into black glass. The trees were gone, vaporized. The sky was clear, the clouds dispersed, the Thunderbirds. Gone. All of them. The alpha was a scorch mark on the permafrost, a crater 50 feet across filled with ash and fragments of bone. The horde that had surrounded it was scattered, dead, their bodies falling from the sky like burned leaves. Sarah tried to move. Her body didn't respond. She looked down at herself and saw why. Her legs were gone. Burned away in the explosion, nothing left but charred stumps ending at the knee. Her arms were still there, but the skin had melted like wax, fused into twisted shapes that would never work again. She could feel her face, feel the damage there, the blindness in one eye, the hanging jaw that wouldn't close. She was dying, she knew that. The cold was already seeping in, and without legs she couldn't find shelter. She would freeze here in this crater alone. Sarah. She turned her head, the movement sending spikes of agony through her ruined body. Elias was there, crawling toward her. He was in worse shape than she was. Most of his body was burned, feathers gone, skin blackened, the transformation that had made him monstrous now making him nearly unrecognizable. "You did it," he rasped. "You killed them." "Not all of them," Sarah whispered. "There will be more, there are always more." "Yes," Elias agreed. He had reached her now, his burned hand finding hers, his fingers locking around her charred palm. "But not today. Today we won." "We're dying," Sarah said. "Yes." "Together." "Yes." They lay there in the crater, holding hands, watching the sky. The aurora borealis was visible, green and blue and violet dancing across the stars. It was beautiful. Sarah focused on that beauty, letting it fill her mind, pushing out the pain, the horror, the memories of what she had seen. "Do you think anyone will find us?" she asked. "Maybe," Elias said. "Maybe not, but they'll find the crater, they'll find the remains, and they'll know that something happened here, something important." "Will they believe it?" "No, but they'll remember. And someday when the Thunderbirds return, and they will return, Sarah, they always do, someday someone will be ready. Someone will believe, and they'll know what to do." "Because of us." "Because of us." The cold was getting worse. Sarah could feel her consciousness fading, her heartbeat slowing. She held Elias' hand tighter, feeling the last warmth of another human being, the last connection in a world that had become so very cold. "Elias," she whispered, "yes. I'm glad I met you." "Me too, Sarah, me too." The aurora danced above them, beautiful and indifferent. The stars wheeled in their eternal patterns. And somewhere, deep in the earth, in caves and mines and the dark places where light had never touched, the thunderstones pulsed and waited. They would sleep again. For decades, maybe centuries, but they would wake. They always woke. And when they did, the sky would scream once more. But that was a story for another time. For now, there was only the cold and the dark, and the gentle fading of consciousness into whatever waited beyond. Sarah Chen, forensic photographer. Elias Veyer, climatologist. Mara Two Feathers, cultural liaison. Gus Flesher, bush pilot. Jordan Reyes and Kevin Park, graduate students. They had fought the storm. They had lost their lives, but they had won the day. And somewhere in the silence that followed, a new storm was already gathering, waiting, watching, hungry. Blood, wings, and broken screams. The radio had been dead for 3 hours before it crackled back to life, sputtering with the wet static of a dying signal. Daryl Henshaw barely registered it at first. His attention was fixed on the blizzard beyond the diner's grimy windows, on the way the snow fell in thick, obscuring sheets that transformed the familiar West Virginia landscape into something alien and unknowable. The truck stop had been his sanctuary for 15 years, a rusted beacon of fluorescent light and burned coffee that he'd haunted since his wife left. Since the nightmares started, since he first developed the photographs that changed everything he thought he knew about the world. But then the radio spoke, and Daryl froze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "If you're hearing this," the voice said, trembling with a static-ridden urgency that made the hairs on Daryl's neck stand erect, "don't look up. Don't look up." The message ended with a sound like tearing metal, like the scream of something massive displacing air, and then the static returned, thick and heavy and absolute. Daryl set his cup down with shaking hands. The diner was empty except for him and the woman sitting 3 booths away, a stranger with dark hollows beneath her eyes and a scarf pulled high around her neck, hiding something Daryl suspected he didn't want to see. "You heard that too," she said. It wasn't a question. Daryl nodded slowly, his hand drifting unconsciously to the breast pocket of his flannel jacket where he kept the photograph. The Polaroid was 15 years old now, the chemicals settling into permanent ghost tones of gray and white, but the image remained burned into his retinas with perfect clarity. The impossible silhouette of massive wings spread against the night sky, the suggestion of eyes that glowed like dying stars, the unmistakable shape of something that had no right to exist in the rational world. He'd taken it on the night of the Silver Bridge collapse, when 46 people died and Daryl survived only because he'd been standing in the exact spot where the Mothman had appeared, warning the last group of would-be victims with its terrible, silent presence. "I'm Elise," the woman said, sliding out of her booth with the practiced grace of someone used to moving through trauma. She wore scrubs beneath her coat, faded blue and stained with substances Daryl didn't want to identify. "Elise Cortez. I was a trauma nurse at Charleston General. Was." "Daryl Henshaw. I drive a truck. Or I did before the weather turned." Elise moved closer, and Daryl saw the way she held her body, the protective tension in her shoulders that spoke of recent injury. When she sat across from him in the cracked vinyl booth, the fluorescent lights caught the edge of her scarf and Daryl saw what she'd been hiding. 3 parallel gashes that ran from her jawline to her collarbone, scabbed over but still angry and red, too deep and too precise to be any accident. "Claw marks," Daryl said quietly. Elise's hand went to her throat instinctively, her eyes darkening with something between fear and shame. "3 nights ago. I was driving home from a double shift when I saw something on Route 62. At first I thought it was a deer in the road, but deer don't stand on 2 legs, and they don't have wings." Daryl felt his blood run cold. Wings. Like a bird, not like a bat, something else, something wrong. Elise pulled her scarf tighter, her gaze fixed on the window. "It looked at me. Those eyes red like brake lights, but somehow worse, hungrier, and then it screamed, and I don't mean a regular scream. It was like someone was driving nails into my skull through my ears. I blacked out. When I woke up, I was in a ditch 3 miles from my car, and these," she touched her wounds, "were the only reason I knew I hadn't dreamed the whole thing." Daryl reached into his pocket and withdrew the Polaroid. He placed it on the table between them, watching Elise's face as she studied the image. Her breath caught, and when she looked up at him, there was recognition in her eyes, recognition and something else, something that looked like the beginning of understanding. "You've seen it too," she whispered. 15 years ago. The Silver Bridge. I was there when." The sound cut him off. It started as a vibration in the floorboards, a low frequency that resonated in Daryl's sternum and made his teeth ache with sympathetic pain. Then it grew, rising in pitch and intensity until it became something else entirely, a shriek like metal being torn apart, like the death cry of some massive industrial machine given voice and fury. The diner's windows rattled in their frames. The fluorescent lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness broken only by the sickly amber glow of the emergency exit signs. "What the hell is that?" Elise gasped, already sliding out of the booth. Daryl didn't answer. He was already moving toward the window, his hand reaching for the baseball bat he kept behind the counter, useless against whatever was coming, but better than nothing. The sound grew louder, closer, and then Daryl saw it. The Jersey Devil emerged from the blizzard like a nightmare given flesh and form. It was larger than any creature had a right to be, standing at least 8 feet tall on hooves that clattered against the frozen asphalt with the sound of bones being struck together. Its body was a grotesque amalgamation of species: equine hindquarters that tapered into a serpentine tail, a torso that suggested both human and avian ancestry, and arms that ended in talons like kitchen knives. But it was the head that made Daryl's sanity recoil, that made him want to claw out his own eyes rather than continue witnessing what unfolded before him. The skull was equine, elongated and wrong, but the face that stretched across it was almost human, mouth filled with rows of needle teeth that gleamed with phosphorescent saliva, eyes like burning coals set too deep in their sockets, and nostrils that flared with each steaming breath. The creature had something in its claws, a deer, or what remained of one. The animal had been gutted with surgical precision, its entrails spilling out in steaming ropes that the devil was in the process of consuming, lifting them to its mouth with obscene delicacy while its prey still kicked weakly in death throes. Blood dripped from the creature's chin, black in the dim light, steaming where it hit the frozen ground. The deer's eyes were still open, filmed with the milky haze of approaching death, its legs twitching in spastic jerks as the Jersey Devil methodically devoured its living organs. "Jesus Christ," Elise whispered behind him. "Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ." "Don't move," Daryl hissed, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. "Don't make a sound." But it was too late. The Jersey Devil's head snapped up, those burning eyes fixing on the diner window with predatory intensity. For a moment, nothing moved, the creature frozen in its obscene feeding, Daryl and Elise paralyzed by the weight of its gaze. Then the devil opened its mouth, and the sound that emerged was worse than the scream that had heralded its arrival. It was a voice, or something approximating a voice, words formed from the wet gurgle of blood and mucus, shaped by a tongue that had never been meant for human speech. "Elise," it gurgled, and Elise's knees buckled beneath her. "Elise, help me." "That's not," Daryl started, but Elise was already shaking, her hands pressed to her ears, her face twisted in an agony of recognition. "Marcus," she moaned. "Oh God, that's Marcus's voice. That's my—" The window exploded inward in a hurricane of glass and snow. Daryl grabbed Elise and threw them both behind the counter as the Jersey Devil surged through the opening, its wings, membranous and veined like those of a massive bat, spreading to fill the space. The creature moved with terrifying speed, hooves skidding on the linoleum as it oriented on Elise, drawn by her terror like a shark to blood and water. Its talons raked across the counter where they had been standing, scoring deep grooves in the laminate with a sound like fingernails on slate. "Elise," the thing croaked again, and now Daryl could hear how wrong it was, how the voice was stretched and distorted, a recording played through a throat not designed for speech. "Why did you leave me, Elise? Why did you let me die?" "It wasn't him," Daryl shouted, dragging Elise toward the kitchen. "It's not real, it's mimicking him." But Elise was lost in her grief, her trauma, the fresh wound of her fiancé's death 6 months prior in a car accident that she had survived only because she'd called in sick that day. The guilt had been eating her alive, and now here was that guilt given voice and flesh and murderous intent. The Jersey Devil lunged, and then the ceiling collapsed. The impact was deafening, a sound like a car crash, like a building imploding, like the very sky tearing open to release something that had been waiting for centuries. Daryl looked up through the hole in the roof and saw it. The Mothman, descending from the storm with its wings spread wide, but not beating, never beating, simply holding the air in abeyance as gravity did what it would to lesser creatures. The Mothman hit the Jersey Devil like a missile. The two creatures tangled in midair, the Mothman's talons raking across the devil's equine skull with a sound like nails on a chalkboard amplified to physical violence. The devil screamed, a sound that made Daryl's vision blur at the edges, and they crashed through the diner's remaining windows in a spray of glass and snow, tumbling across the parking lot in a whirlwind of wings and claws and impossible violence. Daryl didn't hesitate. He hauled Elise to her feet and half-carried, half-dragged her toward the back door, toward his truck still idling in the lot where he'd left it. The cold hit them like a physical blow, the blizzard erasing the world beyond 10 feet in any direction, but Daryl had driven these roads in worse weather. He had the keys in his hand, the door open, Elise shoved into the passenger seat before he allowed himself to look back. What he saw would haunt him until the day he died. The Mothman and the Jersey Devil were locked in combat that transcended the physical laws that governed the world Daryl understood. The Mothman was smaller than its opponent, more compact, its body covered in matted gray fur that might once have been sleek, but was now matted with blood and snow. Its wings, those terrible wings that never flapped, that simply held position against the wind, were torn in places, the membrane hanging in ragged strips that leaked ichor the color of old engine oil. But its eyes, those eyes burned with a crimson intensity that seemed to generate its own heat, turning the falling snow to steam wherever they focused. The Jersey Devil was wounded too, a gash running from its left eye to the corner of its mouth that exposed bone and muscle and something else, something that writhed beneath the wound like maggots in a corpse. It fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, hooves striking sparks from the frozen asphalt as it tried to disembowel the Mothman with kicks that would have shattered concrete. But the Mothman was patient. The Mothman was ancient. It moved with an economy of motion that spoke of countless battles fought in skies that no human had ever seen. When the devil lunged with its claws extended, the Mothman simply wasn't there, shifting position with a flick of its wings that defied physics, appearing behind its enemy to strike at the base of the skull with talons that punched through flesh and found purchase on vertebrae. The devil screamed, and this time there was no mimicry in it, only pain, ancient and terrible and somehow worse for being almost human. It thrashed, wings beating furiously, and the two creatures rose into the air, still locked together, spiraling upward until they were lost in the whiteout of the storm. "Drive," Elise whispered, her voice broken. "Please just drive." Daryl drove. The truck's headlights cut pathetic tunnels through the blizzard as they fled down Route 62, Daryl's hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Elise curled in the passenger seat with her knees drawn to her chest, making sounds that weren't quite words. They drove in silence for 10 minutes, 15, the only sound the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers and the roar of the engine straining against the snow. Then Elise spoke. "It looked at me," she said, her voice hollow. "Before we left, the Mothman, it looked right at me." Daryl risked a glance at her. "What do you mean?" "Its eyes." Elise turned to face him, and Daryl saw something in her expression that terrified him more than the creatures they'd escaped: recognition, understanding, the dawning horror of connection. "It knew me, Daryl. Somehow it knew me. And it wasn't trying to kill us. It was protecting us from that other thing." Daryl wanted to dismiss her words as shock, as the babbling of a mind pushed too far. But he'd seen what she'd seen. He'd watched the Mothman intercept the Jersey Devil's lunge, had seen the calculation in its movements, the way it had positioned itself between the humans and the greater threat. The Mothman of legend was a harbinger of disaster, a warning sign before catastrophe. But what if it had never been the catastrophe itself? What if it had always been trying to warn them, to protect them from something worse? "The radio," Daryl said slowly, "the message. Don't look up." What if that wasn't a warning about the Mothman? What if it was a warning about what's hunting it? Elise didn't answer. She was staring out the window, into the white void of the storm, and Daryl followed her gaze to see what had captured her attention. In the rearview mirror, impossibly distant but growing closer with each second, a single red light burned against the darkness. Not headlights, something else. Something that pulsed with a rhythm that matched the beating of Daryl's heart. "It's following us," Elise whispered. "Which one?" "I don't know, but we can't outrun it, not in this weather." Daryl made a decision. He'd passed a sign 5 miles back, a motel, one of those roadside establishments that catered to truckers and desperate travelers, the kind of place that existed in the liminal spaces between civilizations. The Pine Rest Motor Court. If they could make it there, find shelter, maybe they could figure out what was happening. Maybe they could survive until dawn. The truck slewed across the icy road as Daryl fought to maintain control, the rearview mirror showing that red light growing brighter, closer, the distance between them closing with terrible inevitability. But then, miracle of miracles, Daryl saw it through the swirling snow. The faded neon of the Pine Rest sign, buzzing with electric life that seemed impossibly bright against the whiteout. He pulled into the lot, the tires crunching over unplowed snow, and killed the engine. For a moment they sat in silence, listening to the storm, waiting for whatever was coming. "Nothing, only wind, only snow. We need to get inside," Daryl said, his hand on the door handle. now." They ran for the office, Elise stumbling in the drifts, Daryl catching her arm and half-carrying her the last 20 feet. The door was unlocked, which should have been a warning sign, but Daryl was beyond caring about warning signs. He burst through, dragging Elise with him, and slammed the door behind them with a force that rattled the windows. The office was empty. The desk was covered in papers that had been scattered by a wind that shouldn't have been able to reach inside. The computer monitor showed the frozen blue screen of death. And the smell, Daryl caught it then, the copper tang of blood mixed with something else, something chemical and wrong. "Don't look," he said to Elise, but she was already looking, already seeing what the snow had hidden from the windows. The bodies were in the lobby beyond the office, arranged in a pattern that suggested neither accident nor natural causes. There were at least 6 of them, maybe more. Daryl couldn't tell because they weren't whole. They had been torn apart with such violence that identifying features were theoretical at best. A torso here, still wearing the remains of a flannel shirt. A leg there, boot still attached, lying in a puddle of blood that was already freezing to the carpet. But it wasn't the violence that made Daryl's mind reel. It was the way the bodies had been, modified. Some of them were melted. That was the only word Daryl could find for it. The flesh had dissolved in patches, the bone beneath exposed and blackened as if by acid. The face of one victim had been eaten away completely, leaving nothing but a grinning skull with eyes that had burst from their sockets, the jelly of them running down the man's cheeks like obscene tears. Another had been folded, bent into impossible shapes that no living human could achieve, spine curved into a circle that brought his head between his own legs, limbs wrapped around his torso in configurations that suggested the bones had been liquefied before being allowed to set. His hands had been pushed through his own ribcage, the fingers protruding from his chest like a grotesque bouquet. "Oh God," Elise moaned, turning away to vomit into a wastebasket. "Oh God, oh God." "We need to find shelter," Daryl said, his voice sounding distant and mechanical even to himself. "The rooms. We need to find a room with a door that locks, windows we can cover. We need to call the police." "Look around you, Elise. Do you think the police can help with this? Do you think anyone can?" They found the survivor in room 14. He was wedged behind the toilet in the bathroom, naked except for his underwear, his body covered in scratches that ran parallel like he'd been raked by a garden trowel. His eyes were wide and unseeing, fixed on something that existed only in his memory, and when Daryl knelt beside him, the man began to scream, high and piercing and utterly devoid of sanity. "The bird," he babbled when the screaming subsided into wet gasps. "The bird watched us die. It just watched. Didn't try to stop it, just watched." "What bird?" Daryl demanded, grabbing the man's shoulders. "What did you see?" Red eyes in the mirror in the dark, it pointed. The man's gaze cleared for just a moment, just long enough to fix on Daryl with terrible intensity. It pointed at the bunker, said go underground, said. His eyes rolled back and he collapsed into unconsciousness or something deeper. Daryl stood slowly, his mind racing. The bunker. He knew the place, an old Cold War relic, a fallout shelter built by some paranoid millionaire in the 50s and abandoned ever since. It was 10 miles north, buried in the woods off Route 62. If the Mothman was trying to guide them there, if it was offering some kind of protection. "We need to go," he said to Elise. "Now. We can't leave him. He's beyond help, but we're not yet." They were moving toward the door when the lights died. Not flickered, died. 1 second the fluorescent hum of the motel's inadequate lighting, the next absolute darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. Daryl froze, every instinct screaming at him to run, to hide, to do anything but stand exposed in the blackness. "Daryl!" Elise's voice came from somewhere to his left, trembling with barely controlled terror. "I'm here, don't move. Listen." The sound started low, almost below the threshold of hearing, a vibration more than a noise. It built slowly, rising in pitch and intensity, and Darrell recognized it with sickening certainty. The Jersey Devil. It was here. It had found them. "Elise," the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the space with the wet sound of mimicry. "Elise, I'm cold. I'm so cold down here. Come find me, Elise. Come find me in the dark." "It's not real," Darrell whispered, but he could hear Elise breathing, could hear the way her breath hitched with each word the devil spoke. "Elise, listen to me. Marcus is dead. This thing is using your memory against you." "He sounds so real," Elise sobbed. "Oh God, Darrell, he sounds just like—" The claws punched through the wall beside Darrell's head. He jerked back, stumbling over furniture he couldn't see, crashing into Elise and sending them both sprawling. The wall began to tear, the sound of splintering wood and shredding drywall accompanying the wet, eager breathing of something that had found its prey. "Run!" Darrell screamed, grabbing Elise's hand and dragging her toward where he remembered the door to be. "Run!" They burst through into the night, the blizzard forgotten in the greater terror of what pursued them. Darrell's truck was 10 feet away, 20, a distance that seemed to stretch into infinity as they sprinted through snow that came almost to their knees. Behind them, the motel wall exploded outward, and the Jersey Devil emerged, wounded still, bleeding from a dozen wounds, but hunting with the single-minded focus of something that had never known mercy. They reached the truck. Darrell shoved Elise into the passenger side, ran around to the driver's door, fumbled with keys that had never felt so clumsy in his hands. The devil was closing, hooves striking sparks from the pavement, wings spreading to block out what little light the storm allowed. The engine caught. Darrell floored it. The truck surged forward, plowing through the drifted snow, and for a moment Darrell dared to hope they might escape. But then the rear window exploded, and talons closed around the headrest of Elise's seat, and the devil's face, skull split by the Mothman's earlier attack, one eye hanging loose on its optic nerve, filled the cab with the stench of rot and murder. "Elise," it gurgled, reaching for her throat with claws that dripped with phosphorescent saliva. Darrell slammed on the brakes. The devil wasn't prepared for the sudden deceleration. Its grip slipped, and for a moment it was weightless, suspended between momentum and gravity. That moment was all Darrell needed. He threw the truck into reverse and floored it again, feeling the sickening impact as the rear bumper connected with something solid, the crunch of bone and the wet splatter of fluids against the undercarriage. "Hold on!" Darrell shouted, spinning the wheel, fishtailing across the icy lot until the headlights caught the devil where it lay, writhing, wounded but not dead, never dead, rising on broken legs with a scream that shattered the remaining windows of the motel. Darrell didn't wait to see if it would follow. He pointed the truck north, toward the bunker, toward whatever sanctuary the Mothman had tried to guide them to. The snow was falling harder now, visibility reduced to almost nothing, but Darrell drove like a man possessed, his foot heavy on the accelerator, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror where that single red light had reappeared. Not behind them this time, beside them. The Mothman flew parallel to the truck, no more than 20 feet away, close enough that Darrell could see the details of its form, the way its wings held perfectly still against the wind, the way its eyes burned with that terrible crimson light, the way its head turned to track their progress without any movement of its neck. It was watching them, protecting them, guiding them. And then it was gone, vanished into the storm as if it had never been there at all. "Darrell," Elise whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "I think I'm losing my mind." "Join the club," Darrell replied, but he didn't smile. His hands were shaking on the wheel, his whole body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion and the dawning realization that he might not survive this night, that everything he thought he knew about the world was wrong, that monsters were real and they were hunting him. But the Mothman was real too, and maybe, just maybe, it was on their side. The sign for the bunker appeared through the snow like a ghost, rusted and faded but still legible. Fallout shelter, private property, no trespassing. Darrell didn't hesitate. He turned off the main road onto a track that was barely visible beneath the drifts, the truck's four-wheel drive growling as it fought for purchase on the unplowed surface. They found the entrance half buried in snow, a concrete hatch with a wheel lock that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Darrell grabbed the tire iron from beneath his seat and approached the hatch, his breath coming in ragged clouds, his body screaming for rest he couldn't afford to take. The wheel was frozen solid, rusted into place by years of neglect. Darrell struck it with the tire iron twice, feeling the shock travel up his arms, the pain in his shoulders mounting with each impact. On the third strike, the wheel moved, a fraction of an inch but enough. Darrell threw his whole weight against it, muscles burning, vision swimming at the edges, until finally, with a shriek of metal that sounded almost like the creatures they fled, the hatch cracked open. "Inside," he gasped to Elise. "Quickly." The interior of the bunker was exactly what Darrell had expected from a Cold War relic: concrete walls sweating moisture, shelves lined with supplies that had long since expired, cots with mattresses that had rotted to husks. But it was shelter. It was underground, and the walls were thick enough to withstand nuclear fallout, which meant they might be thick enough to withstand whatever was hunting them. Darrell sealed the hatch behind them, spinning the wheel until it locked with a finality that felt almost like safety. Then he collapsed onto the nearest cot, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion that had been building for hours. Elise sat beside him, her arms wrapped around herself, rocking slightly. "What are they?" she asked, her voice small in the darkness of the bunker. "Really, I mean, what are they?" Darrell didn't have an answer, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim emergency lighting, he saw something that made him sit up straighter, that drove back the fog of exhaustion with a jolt of renewed fear. The walls were covered in drawings. Not graffiti, not the scribblings of bored shelter dwellers waiting for an apocalypse that never came. These were detailed sketches, rendered with materials that might have been charcoal or might have been something else, something darker. They showed the Mothman in every conceivable pose, perched on bridges, hovering over towns, descending from storm clouds with wings spread wide. And in every image, in every single drawing that covered every available inch of concrete, there was one constant: the eyes, those terrible red eyes. But there was something else too. Darrell stood, moving closer to examine the drawings in the feeble light, and he saw what he'd missed at first: the figures in the background. Humans, always humans, depicted in various states of distress. Running, screaming, dying. But in each image, the Mothman was positioned between them and something else, something that was only ever partially shown: a glimpse of hooves, a suggestion of wings, the hint of a skull-like face. "It's been fighting it for years," Darrell breathed. "Decades, maybe longer." "What?" Elise moved to stand beside him, her eyes widening as she took in the scope of the artwork. "Who drew these?" "I don't know, but look." Darrell pointed to the oldest drawing, the one in the corner where the concrete was most stained with age. "This one has a date, 1967, the year of the Silver Bridge collapse." Elise followed his finger and her breath caught. "There's writing. Look there in the corner." Darrell squinted, making out the faded script. It was in a language he didn't recognize at first. No, not a language, a code. A substitution cipher, the kind that conspiracy theorists love to use in their newsletters and amateur documentaries. Darrell had seen enough of them over the years to recognize the pattern. "Help me find something to write with," he said, his mind already working on the translation. "There's paper here somewhere. We need to decode this." They found a notebook in one of the supply lockers, surprisingly preserved in its plastic wrapping, along with a pen that still had ink. Darrell sat on the floor, his back against the cold concrete, and began to work through the cipher, letter by letter, word by word, while Elise held the emergency light and watched the hatch with eyes that never stopped moving. The message took an hour to decode. When Darrell finished, he read it aloud in a voice that trembled with the weight of revelation. "The Watcher comes before the curse. The curse comes from the pines. The Watcher fights the curse, has always fought, will always fight, But the Watcher is not merciful. The Watcher is not kind. The Watcher saves only those who see, and only so they may witness. We are not saved. We are archived. Archived, Elise repeated. What does that mean? I don't know, but there's more. Darryl continued reading, his voice growing softer with each word. The curse was born of fire and blood in the year 1735. A mother desperate called upon powers she didn't understand. The child was cursed, transformed, made into a vessel for something older than the land itself. It has walked the pines for 3 centuries, feeding on fear, growing stronger with each soul it claims. The Jersey Devil, Elise whispered. It's talking about the Jersey Devil. And the Watcher, the Mothman, it's been trying to stop it. For centuries, maybe longer. Darryl set the notebook aside, his mind reeling. The Mothman isn't a monster, Elise. It's a guardian, or it's trying to be. Then why did it kill those people at the motel? Elise asked. Why didn't it stop the devil from slaughtering them? Darryl thought of the survivor's words, the madman in room 14. The bird watched us die, it just watched. The notebook had an answer for that too, Darryl realized. The Watcher saves only those who see. The people at the motel hadn't seen. They'd been victims, collateral damage in a war they didn't know existed. It has rules, Darryl said slowly. The Mothman, I mean. It can only intervene under certain conditions. Only when someone has seen, truly seen, what's hunting them. That's why it came for us at the diner. You saw it first 3 nights ago. That marked you somehow, made you visible to it. And the devil, Elise shuddered. Why is it hunting us? Because you saw it too, at the diner, and once you see it, it sees you, forever. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their situation settling over them like a shroud. Above them, the storm raged on, and somewhere in that white chaos, 2 ancient creatures continued their war. A war that had spilled over into the human world, that had claimed dozens of lives already this night, that might claim dozens more before dawn. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. They took turns sleeping, one always keeping watch while the other drifted in exhausted half-dreams filled with red eyes and wings that never beat. Darryl's dreams were worse than his waking hours, visions of the silver bridge, of the water churning below, of the Mothman's eyes watching him from the darkness as the structure groaned and twisted and finally gave way. In his dream, he saw the bodies falling, heard the screams that had haunted him for 15 years, and beneath it all, the terrible silence of the Mothman's observation. It was during Elise's watch, somewhere around 3 in the morning, that they heard the scream. Not the Jersey Devil's scream, something different, human, agonized, coming from somewhere above, from the surface world they had fled. There's someone out there, Elise whispered, her hand on Darryl's shoulder, shaking him awake. Don't, Darryl mumbled, still caught in the webs of his nightmare. Don't go up there. But they're hurt. They're screaming. The scream cut off abruptly. Not fading, not trailing into silence, but stopping mid-note as if the throat that made it had been suddenly, violently closed. It's bait, Darryl said, fully awake now, his heart pounding. The devil uses mimicry. It can sound like anyone, anything. What if it's not? What if someone actually needs help? Then they're already dead. They sat in silence, listening to the wind, to the creak of the bunker settling around them, to the sound of their own breathing. And then, faint but unmistakable, they heard the clatter of hooves on concrete. It's above us, Elise breathed. It's right above us. The Jersey Devil was hunting them methodically, tracking them by scent or by some other sense that humans didn't possess. They heard it moving overhead, the scrape of claws against the hatch, the wet snuffling sound of something trying to catch a scent. Then the mimicry began again, but this time it wasn't Marcus's voice. Darryl, it croaked, and Darryl felt his blood run cold. Darryl, help me, I'm hurt. It got me, Darryl. It got me like it got the others. That's your wife, Elise said, her eyes wide. That's... Cynthia's been dead for 10 years, Darryl said, his voice flat. Cancer, not this, never this. Darryl, please. the voice continued, and now it was crying, broken, the sound of a woman in agony that Daryl had heard once before, in a hospital room late at night when the morphine stopped working. "It hurts so much. Open the door. Let me in. Let me see you one more time." "Shut up," Daryl whispered, his hands over his ears. "Shut up, shut up, shut up," the thing above them screamed. And this time there was no mimicry in it, only rage, frustration, the howl of a predator denied its prey. The hatch rang with the impact of hooves striking metal again and again, the sound like a bell tolling for the damned. Daryl and Elise huddled together on the floor, waiting for the metal to give, for the devil to find its way through. But the hatch held. The bunker had been built to withstand nuclear war, and whatever the Jersey Devil was, it wasn't a nuclear weapon. The impacts continued for what felt like hours, then minutes, then stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. Silence, complete and absolute. "It's gone," Elise breathed. "It's given up." "No," Daryl said, "it's just thinking, planning, it'll find another way." He was right. An hour later they heard the digging. It started as a scraping sound, distant but growing closer, the sound of claws raking through frozen earth. The Jersey Devil was tunneling, trying to find a way around the hatch, to reach them from the sides or from below. "We can't stay here," Elise said. "We need to move. We need to." "And go where?" Daryl demanded. "Out there in the storm with that thing hunting us. This is the safest place we've found, the only safe place." "Safe?" Elise laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You call this safe, trapped underground while something digs its way in to eat us?" "It's safer than the surface. At least here we have walls. Out there we're exposed." The digging continued, relentless, rhythmic. Daryl tried to track the sound, to figure out where the devil was trying to break through, but the concrete walls made it impossible to pinpoint. It could be coming from any direction, from above or below or the sides, and they wouldn't know until the wall crumbled and the creature poured through. "The sketches," Daryl said suddenly, looking at the walls. "The drawings, they show the Mothman fighting the devil, but they also show something else. Look." He pointed to a series of images in the corner, ones they hadn't examined closely in the darkness. They depicted a pattern, the Mothman appearing, the devil retreating, humans surviving. But always in the final image of each sequence, the Mothman was shown alone, watching from a distance, its eyes glowing in the darkness. "It doesn't just fight," Daryl said. "It drives the devil away. It forces it back to wherever it comes from. The pines," the message said. "The devil has territory. The Mothman can force it back there." "So how do we get it to do that?" Elise asked. "How do we call the Mothman?" "I don't think we can. I think it comes when it wants to come, when the conditions are right." And what conditions would those be? Daryl thought of the notebook of the message. "The Watcher saves only those who see." "We have to see," he said. "We have to witness. That's what it wants. That's what it's always wanted, witnesses, people who know the truth." "So we just, what, go up there and watch them fight, hope the Mothman wins before the devil kills us?" "I don't know, but I know we can't stay here forever. The devil will get in eventually. It's patient. It's been hunting for 300 years." They made their decision as dawn began to lighten the sky. The storm was breaking, visibility improving enough that they might have a chance on the road. The digging had stopped an hour ago, the Jersey Devil either giving up or waiting for them to emerge, but either way they couldn't stay underground indefinitely. They had supplies for perhaps a week, but the air was already growing stale, the weight of the earth above them pressing down like a physical force. "We go up," Daryl said. "We run for the truck. If the devil comes, we fight. If the Mothman comes, we watch. And if neither comes, then we drive until we find help. Real help, not whatever this is." They climbed the ladder to the hatch, Daryl first, Elise following close behind. At the top, Daryl placed his hand on the wheel, feeling the cold metal against his palm, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on his chest. "Whatever happens," he said, not turning around, "thank you for trusting me, for not giving up. Just open the damn hatch, Daryl." He turned the wheel. The seal broke with a hiss of escaping air, and cold rushed in, carrying with it the smell of snow and pine and something else, something coppery and organic and wrong. Darrell pushed the hatch open and climbed out into the morning. The world had been transformed. The blizzard had left a landscape of impossible purity, every surface blanketed in white that glowed with reflected dawn light. The trees stood as silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, and for a moment Darrell allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the creatures had moved on, had found easier prey elsewhere. Then he saw the footprints. They circled the hatch, a track of cloven hooves that had paced and paced and paced, wearing a path in the snow that spoke of obsessive patience. The footprints led away into the trees, toward the road, and Darrell followed them with his eyes to see where they ended. The Jersey Devil was waiting by the truck. It sat on its haunches like a grotesque gargoyle, wings folded against its back, its equine head lowered in a posture that might have been prayer if it had been anything other than what it was. The wound on its face had healed further, the bone knitting together with visible speed, the flesh regenerating even as Darrell watched. It raised its head as they emerged, and its eyes, those burning coals, fixed on them with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Elise," it said, and it was Marcus's voice again, perfect and pure and utterly wrong. "I missed you. I waited for you. Why didn't you come to me in the dark?" "Because you're not Marcus," Elise said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You're a thing, a monster, and I'm not afraid of you anymore." The Jersey Devil's head cocked to one side, bird-like, considering. Then it opened its mouth and screamed, and the scream was answered, from above, from the clearing sky, from somewhere impossibly high, the cry of something else entirely. The Mothman descended like a thunderbolt. It didn't announce itself. It didn't give warning. One moment the sky was empty, the next the Mothman was there, dropping from the clouds with wings spread wide, eyes burning like dying suns. It hit the Jersey Devil with enough force to crater the snow, the two creatures rolling across the ground in a tangle of limbs and wings and tearing claws. "Run!" Darrell screamed, grabbing Elise's hand and pulling her toward the truck. "Get to the truck." They ran, but the creatures were moving too fast, their battle blocking the path to the vehicle. The Mothman had the advantage of surprise, its talons raking across the devil's newly healed face, tearing away the skin that had grown back, exposing the muscle and bone beneath once again. The devil thrashed, its hooves striking the Mothman's body with impacts that should have shattered ribs, but the Mothman simply absorbed the blows, wrapping its wings around the devil's torso and squeezing with crushing force. "Go around," Darrell shouted, pulling Elise toward the trees. "Circle around them." They ran through the snow, breath coming in ragged gasps, the sounds of the battle following them, the wet tearing of flesh, the crunch of breaking bone, the screams of two ancient horrors locked in combat that predated human understanding. Darrell risked a glance back and saw the Mothman lift the devil into the air, its wings beating now, not to fly, but to drive them both toward the ground with crushing force. The impact shook the earth. Snow fell from the trees in heavy sheets, and for a moment both creatures lay still, stunned by the violence of their own collision. Then the Mothman rose, shaking snow from its wings, and turned its gaze toward Darrell and Elise. Those eyes, those terrible red eyes. They didn't blink. They didn't waver. They simply watched, and in their depths, Darrell saw something that might have been recognition, or might have been hunger, or might have been something else entirely, something that no human mind could comprehend. The Jersey Devil stirred, rising on broken legs, and the Mothman turned back to the fight. The battle resumed with renewed fury, the two creatures circling each other in the clearing, trading blows that would have killed any mortal thing instantly. "The truck!" Elise gasped, pulling Darrell toward the vehicle. "Now, while they're distracted." They reached the truck, climbed inside, Darrell's hands shaking as he turned the key. The engine caught, roared to life, and Darrell threw it into drive just as the Jersey Devil broke free of the Mothman's grip and lunged toward them. "Go, go, go!" Elise screamed. Darrell floored it. The truck surged forward, plowing through the snow, and for a second he thought they might make it. But then the devil was there, right beside them, running with impossible speed, its wings spreading to block out the sun. It leaped, talons extended, and struck the side of the truck with enough force to rock it onto two wheels. Daryl fought the wheel, tires spinning on ice, the vehicle slewing sideways toward a stand of trees. He spun the wheel, correcting, and felt the impact as the truck clipped a snowbank, the jolt traveling through his spine like lightning. The Jersey Devil came again, rising into the air and diving at the windshield, its face filling Daryl's vision, its teeth inches from his throat. And then the Mothman was there, intercepting the devil mid-dive, wrapping its wings around the creature and pulling it away, dragging it toward the tree line with desperate strength. "Daryl!" Elise screamed. "Look out!" But Daryl was already looking, already seeing what Elise had seen. The tree line was coming up fast, too fast, the truck's brakes useless on the ice. He spun the wheel, felt the vehicle begin to slide, and then they were in the trees, branches scraping against metal, the world turning over and over as the truck rolled. The impact when they finally stopped was brutal. Daryl's head struck the window, the world exploding in white light and pain, his vision swimming with stars. He tasted blood, felt it running down his face from a gash above his eye, but he could move, could think, could function. "Elise," he groaned, turning to look at her. She was unconscious, slumped against her door, blood streaming from her nose. But she was breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps, and that was something. That was enough. Daryl fumbled with his seatbelt, his fingers clumsy, his head pounding with each heartbeat. Outside, he could still hear them fighting, the sounds of the battle moving deeper into the forest, away from the road, away from the wreckage of the truck. He needed to get out, needed to find shelter, find help, find something. But when he tried the door, it was jammed, twisted by the impact into a frame that wouldn't release. He tried the other side, crawling across Elise's unconscious body, and found that door blocked by a tree trunk that had stopped their roll. They were trapped. "Elise," he said, shaking her shoulder. "Elise, wake up. We need to move." She didn't respond. Her head lolled, and Daryl felt panic rising in his throat. He couldn't carry her, couldn't climb out through the shattered rear window with her dead weight in his arms. He needed her to wake up, needed her to move under her own power. "Elise," the battle sounds had stopped. The forest was silent, eerily still, and that silence was more terrifying than the violence had been. It meant one of them had won. It meant something was coming. Daryl looked up through the shattered windshield and saw it standing in the snow 20 feet away, watching him with eyes that burned like funeral pyres. The Mothman. It was wounded, its gray fur matted with blood and ichor, one wing hanging at a wrong angle where the membrane had been torn. But it was alive, and it was standing, and it was looking at Daryl with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been hunger. "What do you want?" Daryl whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" Mothman didn't answer. It couldn't answer. It simply stood there watching, and Daryl understood at last the true horror of its nature. It wasn't a guardian, not really. It was an observer, a witness. It had saved them at the diner, had protected them from the devil, but not out of kindness, out of interest, out of the same detached curiosity that a scientist might show to bacteria in a petri dish. "The Watcher saves only those who see," the notebook had said. "We are not saved. We are archived." And now Daryl understood. The Mothman was archiving them, recording them, adding their story to whatever collection it kept, whatever memory spanned centuries of human terror. "Go away," Daryl said, his voice stronger now, anger replacing fear. "Leave us alone." The Mothman tilted its head, that bird-like gesture again, and then it moved. Not toward them, but away, into the trees, its injured wing dragging in the snow. It paused at the edge of the clearing and looked back once, those red eyes fixing on Daryl with something that might have been regret. Then it was gone, vanished into the forest, and Daryl was alone with the wreckage and the unconscious woman and the growing certainty that they were going to die out here, that the Mothman had simply been waiting for them to witness something worth recording, and now that they were expendable. But then he heard the engine, a vehicle approaching from the direction of the road, the sound of tires crunching on snow. Daryl tried to call out, but his voice was weak, his throat dry. He pounded on the windshield with his fist, trying to make noise, trying to attract attention. The vehicle stopped, doors opened, footsteps in the snow. "Over here," a voice shouted. "There's a truck in the trees." Daryl slumped back against the seat, relief washing over him like a wave. They were found. They were saved. It was over. But even as the rescuers approached, even as hands reached to pull him from the wreckage, Daryl looked up at the sky and saw it there, a shape against the clouds, wings spread wide, watching. The Mothman was still there, still watching, still archiving. And Daryl knew, with a certainty that transcended reason, that it would always be there. That he and Elise were marked now, part of some collection that would never be complete, some record that would span the rest of their lives. The Jersey Devil had been driven back, forced to retreat to its territory in the pines, nursing its wounds, waiting for the next opportunity. And the Mothman would wait too, patient and eternal, watching from the shadows until the devil returned. Because that was the nature of their war, eternal, cyclical, unending. And humans like Daryl and Elise were just collateral, witnesses to a conflict that had been raging since before their grandparents were born, that would continue until long after their grandchildren were dust. They were pulled from the truck, loaded into an ambulance, driven to a hospital where doctors treated their wounds and psychologists evaluated their sanity. They told their story, or parts of it, and were met with sympathetic nods and prescriptions for anxiety medication. The truck crash was attributed to black ice, the injuries to the accident. No mention of monsters. No mention of things that shouldn't exist. But Daryl knew, and Elise knew, and when they were finally released, when they stood on the hospital steps blinking in the winter sunlight, they turned to each other and spoke the words that had been building between them for days. "It's not over," Elise said. "No," Daryl agreed. "It's never over." They parted there, exchanging phone numbers, promising to stay in touch, knowing that they would see each other again when the next crisis came. Because it would come. The Mothman had seen to that, had marked them both, had added them to its collection. And somewhere in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, the Jersey Devil was healing, growing stronger, remembering the taste of human fear and the frustration of being denied its prey. It would be back. They all knew it. The war between blood wings and broken screams had only just begun. 3 months passed. 3 months of sleepless nights, of waking in terror at every creak of the house, of seeing red eyes in every reflection. Daryl tried to resume his life, tried to drive his truck, to visit his usual stops, to pretend that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The world was different now, darker, more dangerous, filled with shadows that moved with purpose and purpose alone. He saw the Mothman everywhere. In the rearview mirror of his truck, watching from the back seat. In the darkened windows of buildings as he passed, a shape that shouldn't be there, eyes that shouldn't glow. It never approached, never threatened, never did anything but watch. But that watching was worse than any attack could have been. It was the gaze of an archivist, cataloging his every move, his every fear, his every moment of weakness. Elise called him weakly. Her voice was different now, harder, more certain. She had moved to Pittsburgh, taken a job at a hospital there, trying to put distance between herself and the memories. But the distance didn't help. The Mothman found her there too, watching from the rooftops of buildings, reflected in the glass of skyscrapers, a constant reminder that she was not free, that she had been claimed by something that didn't understand the concept of release. "It's getting worse," she told him during their call in March, 3 months to the day since the bunker. "The devil, it's back." Daryl felt his blood freeze. "How do you know?" "The news. 3 bodies found in the Pine Barrens, torn apart. The police are calling it animal attacks, but..." She paused, and Darryl could hear her breathing, ragged and afraid. I saw the photos, Darryl, online. The wounds, they're the same. The same as the motel, the same as... I know. It's hunting again, and that means... The Mothman will come too, Darryl finished. It's starting again. They met in Harrisburg, halfway between their respective homes, in a diner that could have been the twin of the one where they'd first encountered the devil. The coffee was bad, the eggs were worse, but neither of them was there for the food. They were there because they needed to plan, to prepare, to face whatever was coming together. I've been researching, Elise said, sliding a folder across the table. The Mothman sightings, they're not random, there's a pattern. Darryl opened the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, printouts of blog posts, photographs of sketches and murals and graffiti. All of them showed the same thing: red eyes, spread wings, the silhouette of something that didn't belong in the rational world. The Mothman appears before disasters, Elise explained. That's the standard theory, but look closer, look at what kind of disasters. Darryl looked. Bridge collapses, mine cave-ins, factory explosions, and always in the days before, sightings of the Mothman, warnings that went unheeded, cryptic messages that only made sense in retrospect. But there's something else, Elise continued. Look at the locations: Point Pleasant, the Pine Barrens, the border between West Virginia and New Jersey. The Mothman doesn't just appear before disasters. It appears where the Jersey Devil has been active. You're saying... I'm saying the Mothman doesn't warn about disasters. It warns about the devil. The disasters happen because of the devil, because of the collateral damage of its hunts. The Mothman tries to minimize the casualties, tries to get people to evacuate, but it can't stop the devil completely. It can only contain it, drive it back. Darryl thought of the bunker, of the drawings on the walls, of the message in the notebook. The Watcher fights the curse. So every major Mothman sighting has been the aftermath of a battle. The Mothman and the devil fighting for territory, for feeding grounds, for whatever it is that drives them. And humans get caught in the middle. The bridge collapse, Darryl said slowly. The Silver Bridge. I thought the Mothman caused it, but what if? What if the devil was there first? What if the bridge collapsed because they were fighting on it? Elise nodded. That's what I think. That's what the evidence suggests. The Mothman isn't the monster. It's the response to the monster, the immune system of the world fighting an infection. So what do we do? Darryl asked. How do we help it? I don't know if we can, but I know we can't just sit and wait. The devil is hunting again, which means it's getting stronger. And that means the Mothman will come and the battle will happen and people will die. Unless... Unless what? Elise leaned forward, her eyes intense. Unless we find the devil's weakness. Unless we find a way to kill it permanently, not just drive it back. They spent weeks researching, digging through archives and libraries and the dark corners of the internet where conspiracy theories flourished. They found stories, legends, myths that stretched back centuries, tales of creatures that walked the night, of curses that couldn't be broken, of ancient wars fought in shadows. And then they found it. In a book of Pennsylvania folklore, in a chapter about the Pine Barrens, there was a reference to the Jersey Devil's origin. Not the standard story about Mother Leeds and her curse, but something older, something darker. The pines were haunted before Mother Leeds gave birth, Darryl read aloud, his finger tracing the faded text. The creature she summoned was already there, waiting for a vessel. The Leeds child wasn't cursed. It was possessed by something that had been in the pines since before the colonists came, since before the Lenape, since before humans walked this land at all. An old god, Elise whispered, or something like one. Something that can't be killed, only contained, bound to a specific territory, the pines. It can leave, can hunt elsewhere, but it always has to return. The pines are its anchor, its prison. So how do we kill it? Darryl turned the page and his breath caught. We can't, but we can strengthen the prison." The ritual was ancient, described in fragments across multiple sources, Native American traditions mixed with European folklore, African spiritual practices, Asian exorcism rites. A synthesis of human attempts to contain the uncontainable, to bind the unbindable. It required fire, sacred wood, and blood. "White ash," Darrell said. "The Mothman is vulnerable to it too. The bunker drawings, the ones that showed the devil retreating, they all had white ash in the background. Fires, burning." "So we burn the pines," Elise said. "Set the whole forest on fire." "Not the whole forest, just the heart of it, the place where the devil is anchored. If we can burn that, if we can destroy its connection to this world. It might die, or it might just be banished, sent somewhere else. Either way, it stops hunting here, stops killing here." They made their plans carefully, methodically. They would need supplies, gasoline, white ash wood, materials to start and control a fire. They would need to find the heart of the pines, the place where the devil's power was strongest. And they would need to do it before the next battle, before the Mothman arrived and the collateral damage began. The preparations took a month. A month of Darrell driving his truck through the pine barrens at night, mapping the areas where the devil had been most active, where the bodies had been found, where the sense of wrongness was strongest. A month of Elise researching fire containment, forestry management, the legal and practical realities of setting a controlled burn in a protected wilderness area. They found the heart on a Tuesday in April. It was a clearing deep in the forest, a place where the trees grew twisted and wrong, where the ground was covered in bones, animal bones mostly, but some that looked disturbingly human. The air was thick there, heavy with a smell like rotting flowers and copper and something else, something that Darrell's mind refused to identify. "This is it," Elise said, her voice hushed. "This is where it sleeps, where it heals." They marked the location on their maps and retreated, planning to return with everything they needed to complete the ritual. But they were being watched. They had been watched since they entered the pines, since they began their research, since they first spoke of fire and banishment. The Jersey Devil knew they were coming. The attack came 3 days before they were scheduled to return. Darrell was in his truck, driving through a stretch of highway that bordered the Pine Barrens, when he saw it in the rearview mirror. Not the Mothman, something worse, something closer. The devil was riding in his truck bed. It rose up behind him, wings spread, face pressed against the rear window, its eyes burning with a rage that transcended animal instinct. This was personal now. They had threatened its territory, its anchor, its existence, and it was going to punish them for that hubris. Darrell floored the accelerator, weaving through traffic, horns blaring around him. The devil clung to the truck, talons digging into the metal, its face a mask of hatred and hunger. It struck the window with its head once, twice, and the glass spider-webbed with cracks. "No, no, no," Darrell whispered, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel. "Not like this. Not now." The third strike shattered the window. The devil reached through, talons extended toward Darrell's throat, and Darrell did the only thing he could think of. He slammed on the brakes. The truck fishtailed, tires screaming on asphalt, and the devil was thrown forward over the cab onto the hood. Darrell accelerated again, aiming for a guardrail, hoping to scrape the creature off, but the devil held on, its claws punching through the hood, its face grinning at him through the windshield. "Elise knows," it said, and it was Marcus's voice again, twisted and cruel. "She knows where you are, she's coming to help, and when she arrives, I'll be waiting." Darrell realized with horror what the devil was doing. It was baiting him, playing with him, drawing out the hunt for its own amusement. But it was also isolating him, separating him from Elise, picking them off one by one. He grabbed his phone, keeping one hand on the wheel, and speed-dialed her number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "Darrell," her voice was breathless, panicked. "I'm on my way. I saw it on the news, your truck on the highway." "Don't come," Darrell shouted. "It's a trap it wants you to stay away from." The devil struck the windshield again, and this time it broke, showering Daryl with glass. The creature's talons closed around his throat, lifting him from his seat, choking off his words, his breath, his life. "Tell her," the devil whispered, its breath hot against Daryl's face, smelling of rot and copper and death. "Tell her where to find your body." Daryl felt his consciousness fading, his vision narrowing to a tunnel with the devil's burning eyes at the end. He kicked out, his foot finding the accelerator, and the truck surged forward, still aimed at the guardrail. The impact was devastating. Metal screamed against metal, the truck flipping, rolling, coming to rest on its side in the ditch beside the highway. Daryl hung suspended by his seatbelt, blood running into his eyes from a dozen cuts, his throat bruised but intact. The devil was gone, thrown clear by the crash. Daryl could see it through the shattered windshield, rising from the ground, shaking off the impact, preparing to finish what it had started. And then the sky darkened, and the Mothman fell upon them like divine judgment. The battle was terrible to behold. The Mothman struck the devil with enough force to crater the earth, the two creatures rolling across the highway in a tangle of violence that sent cars swerving, crashing, adding to the chaos. The Mothman's eyes burned brighter than Daryl had ever seen, and for the first time he thought he understood the creature's rage. Not just duty, not just ancient obligation, but hatred, pure, burning hatred for the thing it had been forced to fight for centuries uncounted. Daryl, Elise was there, running from her car where she'd stopped on the shoulder, dodging through the wreckage, risking everything to reach him. "No," Daryl tried to shout, but his throat wouldn't work, his voice barely a whisper. "Run!" But she didn't run. She reached the truck, climbed onto the side, and began working on his seatbelt with shaking hands. "I'm getting you out of here," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "We're finishing this. Tonight." The battle continued, the creatures moving too fast to track, a blur of wings and claws and blood. Daryl saw the Mothman strike a blow that should have killed anything mortal, saw the devil's skull cave in under the impact, but the creature simply healed, bone knitting together, flesh regenerating, and came back for more. They can't kill each other, Daryl realized, his voice gaining strength as adrenaline overrode pain. They've been fighting too long. They know each other's weaknesses too well. The only way to end this is to break the cycle, to banish the devil permanently. "The ritual," Elise said. "The fire, we have to get to the clearing." "How?" "We're in the middle of a highway, surrounded by—" The Mothman landed on the hood of the overturned truck, its weight making the metal groan. It looked at Daryl, those red eyes fixing on him with terrible intensity, and then it did something it had never done before. It spoke. Not with words, but with images, impressions, memories that flooded Daryl's mind like a tidal wave. He saw the centuries of battle, the endless cycle of violence, the thousands of humans caught in the crossfire. He saw the Mothman's frustration, its exhaustion, its desperate hope that someone would finally understand, would finally help it end the war. "The clearing," Daryl gasped, clutching his head as the visions faded. "It wants us to go to the clearing. It will hold the devil there. Give us time to prepare the fire." "How do we know it won't just kill us both when we get there?" "We don't, but I don't think it will. It's been trying to help us, in its way." Elise helped Daryl from the truck, supporting him as he stumbled toward her car. Behind them, the Mothman and the devil renewed their battle, the sound of their conflict like thunder rolling across the sky. They drove to the clearing, Daryl navigating from memory, his head clearing with each mile they put between themselves and the battlefield. By the time they reached the edge of the pines, he was functional again, if not whole. They unloaded the supplies from the trunk, gasoline, white ash kindling, fire starters, and the other materials they'd gathered for the ritual. "We need to draw the devil here," Daryl said. "The Mothman will try to drive it toward us, but we need to make sure it follows. We need bait." "Human bait," Elise said quietly. "It wants us anyway." "Yes." They set up the pyre in the center of the clearing, arranging the white ash in a pattern they'd found in the old texts, a containment circle, a prison of fire. The gasoline soaked into the wood, the fumes making their eyes water, their heads spin. They placed the kindling carefully, methodically, creating a structure that would burn hot and fast when ignited. And then they waited. The sounds of battle drew closer, the screams of the devil and the terrible silence of the Mothman growing louder with each passing minute. Trees fell in the distance, great crashes of timber that marked the path of destruction as the creatures fought their way toward the clearing. "It's coming," Daryl said, clutching the flare gun they'd brought. "Get ready." They broke through the tree line together, locked in combat, the Mothman's talons buried in the devil's throat, the devil's claws raking at the Mothman's wings. The creatures rolled into the clearing, and for a moment the Mothman had the upper hand, pinning the devil to the ground, its eyes burning with triumphant rage. "Now," Daryl screamed, firing the flare gun. The flare struck the pyre and the gasoline ignited with a roar. White flames leaped into the sky, hot enough to burn the devil's flesh, to cauterize its wounds, to prevent the regeneration that had kept it alive for centuries. The creature screamed, a sound like metal tearing, like the end of the world, and tried to rise. But the Mothman held it down, wrapping its wings around the devil's body, trapping it in the circle of fire. "More!" Elise shouted, throwing additional fuel onto the flames. "We need more." The fire consumed them both, Mothman and devil locked together in a burning embrace. The heat was intense, driving Daryl and Elise back to the edge of the clearing, but they could see what was happening. The devil was burning, truly burning, its flesh bubbling and blackening, its screams becoming weaker, more desperate. But the Mothman was burning too. "No," Daryl whispered. "No, that's not." "It knew," Elise said, her voice breaking. "It knew this would happen. It's sacrificing itself." The Mothman's eyes met Daryl's across the flames, and in that gaze there was no regret, only purpose, only the satisfaction of a duty finally fulfilled, a war finally ended. The fire burned for hours, consuming everything in the clearing. When it finally died down, when the flames had reduced to embers and the smoke had cleared, there was nothing left but ash. No bodies, no bones, no sign that anything had ever existed there at all. Daryl and Elise stood in the ruins of the clearing, surrounded by scorched earth and the smell of burning wood. They were alive. The devil was gone. The Mothman was gone. The war was over. They walked back to the car in silence, too exhausted to speak, too overwhelmed to process what had happened. They drove back to civilization, to hospitals and police stations, and the explanations they would have to give for the carnage on the highway. But when they arrived, they found confusion rather than accusation. The wreckage was there, the destroyed vehicles, the injured drivers, but no one remembered the creatures. The witnesses spoke of a sudden storm, of freak winds, of a gas line explosion that had caused the pileup. The Mothman and the Jersey Devil had been erased from memory, reduced to natural disaster and mass hallucination. Daryl and Elise told their story, or a version of it, and were met with sympathetic nods and prescriptions for PTSD. They were believed in a way, but not understood. How could they be? Weeks passed. The wounds healed. The nightmares faded, replaced by a different kind of haunting, the memory of red eyes and burning wings, the knowledge of sacrifice that had saved them. Elise returned to Pittsburgh. Daryl resumed his trucking routes, though he avoided the Pine Barrens now, took the long way around rather than pass through that cursed territory. And then 6 months after the fire, Daryl developed the last roll of film from his camera. The photos showed the highway, the crash, the battle. And in the final image, taken as the flames consumed the clearing, there was a shape in the smoke. Wings spread wide, eyes glowing red, not burning, not dying, watching. Daryl looked closer and he saw what the image truly showed. The Mothman hadn't died in the fire. It had transcended it, become something else, something that existed in smoke and shadow and the spaces between moments. The devil was gone, banished or destroyed, its hold on the world broken. But the Mothman remained, changed perhaps, weakened certainly, but still watching, still waiting, still archiving. Daryl hung the photo on his wall where he could see it every day. A reminder that some wars never truly end, that some guardians never rest, that the world was stranger and more wonderful and more terrible than any human mind could fully comprehend. And sometimes, late at night, when the shadows grew long and the silence grew deep, Daryl would look at that photo and think he saw the eyes move, the wings shift, the smoke rearrange itself into new patterns. Some things don't hunt, they wait. And the Mothman, eternal and patient, would wait until the next threat emerged, the next darkness rose, the next war began. It would be there as it always had been, fighting battles that humans could not see, protecting those who would never understand the price that was paid on their behalf. Blood, wings, and broken screams. The battle was over, but the vigil continued. Forever. 1 year later, the anniversary of the fire in the pines, of the battle that had ended the war. Daryl stood in his apartment, looking at the photograph on his wall, the image of wings and smoke that had haunted his dreams for 12 months. He had tried to move on, tried to forget, tried to reclaim the normal life he had lived before the diner and the devil and the creature with red eyes. But normal was impossible now. He saw the signs everywhere, in the way shadows moved when no one was casting them, in the reflections that showed things that weren't there, in the eyes of strangers who looked at him with too much knowledge, too much recognition. The Mothman was still watching, still archiving, still waiting for whatever came next. Elise called him that morning, her voice tight with an emotion he couldn't identify. "I need to see you," she said. "It's important." They met in the same diner where it had begun, the truck stop on the border between West Virginia and New Jersey. The place had been rebuilt after the devil's attack, the shattered windows replaced, the damaged ceiling repaired, but Daryl could still see the scars, could still feel the presence of what had happened there. "I've been seeing things," Elise said without preamble. "Not just memories, new things, things that haven't happened yet. Visions. Warnings, the Mothman. It's showing me things, disasters that are coming, places where the devil's kind are waking up." Daryl felt a chill run down his spine. "The devil's dead, we saw it burn." "The Jersey Devil is dead," Elise corrected. "But it's not the only one, there are others. Things like it, creatures from before history waking up as the world changes. Climate change, habitat destruction. The old boundaries are failing, the prisons are opening. And the Mothman is trying to hold them back, but it's alone now. There were others once, other watchers, other guardians, but they've faded, died, lost their connection to the world. The Mothman is the last." "How do you know this?" Elise reached into her bag and withdrew a journal, leather-bound and ancient, the pages yellowed with age. "I found this in an antique shop in Pittsburgh. The shopkeeper didn't know what it was, but when I touched it," she paused, her eyes distant, "I saw things, memories that weren't mine, the history of the Watchers." Daryl opened the journal and the pages moved under his fingers, rearranging themselves, showing him images that couldn't exist, creatures of shadow and flame, battles in skies that no longer existed, the endless cycle of violence that had shaped the world. "It's recruiting us," Daryl said slowly. "The Mothman. It wants us to help." "Yes." Why us?" "Because we saw, because we understand, because we're already part of the archive." They spent the day reading, learning, absorbing knowledge that no human was meant to possess. The world was older than science claimed, filled with things that had been forgotten, suppressed, buried beneath layers of rationalization and denial. The Mothman was just one of many guardians that had been created or born or evolved to protect humanity from the things that would destroy it. But the guardians were failing. The world was changing too fast, the threats multiplying, the old ways of containment breaking down. The Mothman needed help, needed allies, needed witnesses who could see the truth and act on it. "What does it want us to do?" Daryl asked. "Travel," Elise said. "Go where the signs point. Help the Mothman contain the new threats. Document what we see. Add to the archive." "And the danger," We could die, probably will die eventually, but if we don't do this, if we don't help. Elise closed the journal, her eyes meeting Daryl's. The world burns, not metaphorically, literally. The things that are waking up, they don't care about humanity. We're just food to them, just prey. Daryl thought of the Jersey Devil, of its hunger, its cruelty, its absolute indifference to human suffering. Thought of the Mothman, fighting alone for centuries, never asking for thanks, never expecting reward. "I'm in," he said. They left that night, driving Elise's car toward the first sign. Reports of strange lights in the sky over rural Ohio, of cattle mutilations that didn't match any known predator, of something that watched from the darkness with eyes that glowed like the embers of dying stars. The Mothman met them at the state line, appearing in the rearview mirror as it always did, its eyes fixed on them with an expression that might have been gratitude, or might have been simply recognition. They drove through the night, following the creature's guidance, heading toward whatever horror awaited them. They were not heroes. They were not chosen. They were simply witnesses, survivors, people who had seen the truth and could not look away. The war between blood wings and broken screams had been one battle in an eternal war. And now they were soldiers in that war, fighting alongside the last of the Guardians, documenting the horrors that humanity refused to see. The Mothman spread its wings against the night sky, and Daryl felt a strange sense of peace. This was his purpose now, his destiny, not to defeat the darkness, that was beyond any human, but to witness it, to record it, to ensure that someone would remember when the end finally came. Some things don't hunt, they wait. And Daryl Henshaw, once a simple truck driver, now a witness to the eternal, settled in for the long vigil, knowing that the red eyes would always be there, always watching, always waiting for the next time the shadows grew long and the monsters stirred. The archive was open. The war continued. And blood wings would fly forever against the darkness. The Ohio field stretched endlessly under a moonless sky, corn stalks rustling with whispers that had nothing to do with wind. Daryl gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, watching the Mothman's shadow flit across the dashboard as it flew overhead, its silhouette blocking out stars in patterns that made his eyes water. "What are we looking for exactly?" Elise asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of tires on asphalt. "The journal says something called a hollow chorus," Daryl replied, his eyes darting between the road and the sky. "Multiple entities, pack hunters, they mimic sounds to lure prey. Like the devil mimicked Marcus. Similar, but these don't take individual forms. They manifest as—" Daryl paused, struggling with concepts that defied language. "As absences, empty spaces where things should be." Elise shuddered, pulling her jacket tighter. "I saw one once, in the hospital, after the bunker. A patient died on my watch, heart failure, and in the moment after, while I was trying to revive him, I saw something standing where he had been. Something that looked like him but wrong, like a photograph where the person is missing but the outline remains." Daryl glanced at her. "You never told me that." "I thought I was hallucinating, trauma response. But now," she trailed off, pointing ahead. The Mothman had descended, landing in the center of the road with wings spread wide, blocking their path. Its eyes blazed crimson, and it raised one taloned hand to point toward the fields. Daryl stopped the car. They sat in silence, listening. At first there was nothing, just the usual sounds of night, crickets, wind, the distant rumble of a train. Then the crickets stopped. Not gradually, instantly. One moment their chorus filled the air, the next absolute silence. The absence of sound pressed against Daryl's eardrums like a physical weight. "There," Elise whispered. Between the rows of corn, Daryl saw it. A shape that was wrong, too tall, too thin, proportions that violated the rules of anatomy. It moved slowly, deliberately, and as it passed each stalk, the corn seemed to forget it was there. The plants didn't bend or break, they simply ceased to exist in that space, creating a corridor of emptiness through the field. "How many?" Daryl asked. "I count 3, Elise pointed. "There, and "Oh God, there's one behind us." Daryl checked the rear-view mirror. The road behind them stretched empty, but in the mirror's reflection he saw it, a shape standing where their tire tracks should be, erasing their passage as it moved. They can only exist where something else isn't, Daryl realized, his mind working frantically. They're hollows, absences. They have to displace something to be here. So if we fill the space, they can't manifest. The Mothman screamed. The sound wasn't audible so much as felt, a vibration in Daryl's bones that drove him to his knees, his hands pressed against the dashboard. The hollow chorus screamed back, a counter-frequency that made his vision blur, his nose bleed, his thoughts scatter like frightened birds. "Light!" Elise shouted, fumbling for the car's controls. "They need darkness. Turn on everything." She activated the high beams, the hazard lights, the interior dome. The effect was immediate. The creatures in the field recoiled, their forms distorting, stretching, struggling to maintain coherence in the sudden illumination. The Mothman took advantage, diving into their midst with talons extended. The battle was unlike anything Daryl had seen. The Mothman fought not by striking, but by occupying space, spreading its wings to block the hollow chorus's movements, forcing them into corners where they couldn't displace enough matter to maintain their forms. But there were 3 of them, and they were learning, adapting. One of them lunged for the car. Daryl threw the vehicle into drive and floored it, tires spinning on the asphalt before catching. The creature passed through the space where the car had been, its hollow form momentarily occupying the same space as Daryl's body. The pain was indescribable. Every nerve ending screamed as the absence tried to displace his existence, tried to hollow him out from the inside. He saw himself fading, becoming a silhouette, a memory of a man rather than a man. Then Elise slammed her hand against the horn, a blast of sound that drove the creature back, and Daryl snapped back into himself, gasping, vomiting onto the steering wheel. "Don't stop!" Elise screamed. "Keep driving." He drove. The corn whipped past, the creatures falling behind, the Mothman fighting a delaying action in his rearview mirror. Daryl watched the battle recede, watched the red eyes grow distant until finally the road curved and the creatures were lost from sight. They drove for 10 minutes before Daryl felt safe enough to pull over. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely operate the gear shift. His mouth tasted of copper and bile. "What the hell was that?" he gasped. "The next threat," Elise said quietly. "The beginning of the end." She held up the journal. Its pages were turning on their own, flipping to a section they hadn't read before, a chapter titled "The Final War." "The hollow chorus isn't just one type of creature," she read. "It's a symptom. The boundaries between worlds are failing. More and more of them will come through, and eventually—" She stopped, her finger hovering over a passage. "What?" Daryl demanded. "Eventually they'll come through in numbers too great to stop. The Mothman can't fight them all. No one can." Daryl looked up at the sky, where the creature's silhouette still tracked their position, faithful and eternal. "Then we help it find others, other guardians, other witnesses." "How?" "The archive. The Mothman has been watching for centuries, recording everything. Somewhere in that archive there must be information about where the other guardians went, how to wake them, how to bring them back." Elise studied the journal, her brow furrowed. "There's a map," she said finally. "Coordinates, places where the Mothman has fought before, where other creatures have been sealed away." "How many?" 13, Daryl laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Of course, 13. They set out that night, driving toward the first coordinate, a place in Kentucky where something called the Pope Lick Monster was said to dwell. Another guardian, perhaps, or another threat. The Mothman followed, its red eyes never leaving them, its wings spread against the coming dawn. The war was expanding. The archive was growing. And Daryl and Elise, once merely survivors, had become something else entirely, archivists in their own right, witnesses to the eternal battle between order and chaos, between the watchers and the watched. Some things don't hunt, they wait. But now, at last, the hunters had hunters of their own. The blood wings were not alone anymore. And the broken screams would soon learn that humanity, for all its fragility, could be the most terrible force of all when roused to witness, to remember, to fight. The archive would not be silent. The war would continue. But the tide was beginning to turn. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.